Wyoming, 1883. Catherine Hale stood frozen outside the general store, empty basket trembling in her grip. "No credit," the shopkeeper had said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. Her 6-year-old son hadn't eaten since yesterday. Pride told her to walk away. Desperation screamed louder. Then a voice, low, steady, unfamiliar, cut through the wind. "Come with me. I'll fill your table tonight." She turned to face a stranger whose eyes held no pity, only promise. "Stay with me until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels." The wind that November afternoon didn't just blow through Sheridan, Wyoming, it cut. Catherine Hale felt it slice through the threadbare wool of her coat as she stood on the warped planks outside Morrison's general store, her empty wicker basket hanging from one arm like a confession of failure. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater, pregnant with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall, and the cold had teeth that bit down to the marrow. Inside the store, she could see the shapes of other customers moving behind the clouded windows. Normal people. People with money or credit or family who vouched for them. People who belonged to the carefully maintained social architecture of this frontier town in ways she no longer did. Not since Thomas died. Not since the ranch failed. Not since she'd become one of those women people talked about in lowered voices, a widow trying to hold together a life with nothing but willpower and increasingly empty cupboards. Her hands tightened on the basket handle. The wicker creaked. She'd woven this basket herself 3 summers ago, back when there had been enough of everything, enough food, enough hope, enough husband. Thomas had laughed at her meticulous weaving, called it Catherine's fancy work, but he'd been proud too. She'd seen it in his eyes. Now Thomas was 2 years buried on a hillside she couldn't afford to visit with flowers, and the basket that had once carried abundance held only the ghost weight of what she needed and couldn't have. The door of the general store swung open with a bright jangle of bells, mocking in their cheerfulness. Amelia Pritchard emerged, arms full of brown paper packages tied with string. Her dress was new calico, and her boots showed no signs of the repairs and re-repairs that marked Catherine's footwear. Amelia's eyes slid over Catherine like water over stone, smooth and quick, registering her presence and simultaneously deciding she wasn't worth acknowledging. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pritchard," Catherine said anyway, because her mother had raised her to have manners even when the world had none for her in return. Amelia paused just barely. "Mrs. Hale." The words were frost itself. Then she was past, skirt swishing, packages secure, her small comforts guaranteed in a way Catherine's had stopped being. Catherine watched her go, watched the way Amelia walked with the certainty of someone whose credit was good, whose place in the world was assured, whose children, 4 of them plump as spring pullets, would eat tonight without question. Something hot and bitter rose in Catherine's throat, and she swallowed it down hard. Envy was a poison. She'd seen what it did to people, how it curdled them from the inside out. She wouldn't let it take her too. But God, she was hungry. And more than that, more than her own empty stomach that had learned to tie itself into knots of silence, Micah was hungry. Her boy, 6 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, currently back at their cabin doing his letters by firelight because they couldn't afford lamp oil, and she was too proud to let him see her beg, except she was about to beg. She'd decided that this morning, when Micah had eaten half of their last hardtack biscuit and insisted, with the fierce determination of childhood, that he was full, that he didn't want any more, that Mama should have the rest. He'd lied. She'd seen through it instantly, the way mothers do, seen the hunger still living in his eyes, even as his small jaw worked with false satisfaction. And something inside her had simply broken. Or maybe it had finally calcified into something hard enough to do what needed doing. So she'd put on her lease-patched dress, the one she saved for church when she could make herself go, and she'd taken the basket, and she'd walked the 2 miles into town with her head high and her heart hammering against her ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. She'd stood in front of Silas Morrison's counter for 5 full minutes before he'd even acknowledged her presence, his attention seemingly absorbed by his ledger, his thick fingers moving across columns of numbers while she waited, feeling the eyes of other customers on her back, burning holes through her coat. When he'd finally looked up, his expression had been carefully neutral, in the way that was somehow worse than open disdain. Mrs. Hale. Mr. Morrison. Her voice had come out steadier than she'd expected. Small mercies. I need to open a line of credit. His eyebrows had risen slightly, as if she'd said something in a foreign language. Behind her, she'd heard the whisper of conversation pause, then resume in a lower register. Everyone listening, everyone knowing. Small towns were like that. Your business was performed on a stage whether you wanted an audience or not. Mrs. Hale, Morrison had said slowly, his voice carrying the particular gentleness people used when delivering bad news to children or simpletons. You know I can't do that. I can pay it back. The words had tumbled out faster than she'd intended. I've got the cabin, the land. It's not much, but it's something. I'm good for it, Mr. Morrison. I just need time. Just until spring, when I can get the garden going properly, when I can... Ma'am? He'd cut her off, not unkindly, but firmly. Final. You already owe me $14 from last winter. I carried you as long as I could, you know that. But I can't keep doing it. I've got my own family to think about, my own bills to pay. Please. She'd hated the way the word had cracked coming out, hated the hot pressure behind her eyes that threatened tears. My boy hasn't had a proper meal in 3 days. I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for a child. Morrison's face had flickered then. Something that might have been sympathy, might have been guilt, gone too fast to properly identify. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale, I truly am, but the answer is no. No credit. He'd said it loud enough that there could be no mistaking, no pretending later that she'd misheard, that there might be some alternative arrangement. The words had landed in the store like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of awareness out to every corner, every listening ear. No credit. A pronouncement. A verdict. She'd nodded once, sharply, as if he'd merely answered a simple question about the weather, and turned on her heel. She'd walked to the door with her spine straight as a rifle barrel, had grasped the handle and pulled it open herself, though John Teague had been standing right there and might have done it for her if she'd paused even half a second. She hadn't paused. She'd walked out into the cold afternoon with her empty basket and her shredded pride and somehow made it to the porch before her knees had started to shake. That's where she stood now, several minutes later, trying to remember how to breathe properly, trying to figure out what came next. There were other stores in Sheridan, but they all knew each other, all talked. By supper time, every merchant in town would know that Catherine Hale had been denied credit at Morrison's. Her chances of getting help anywhere else had just evaporated like summer rain on hot stone. She could write to her cousin in Philadelphia. Martha had married well, married a banker, lived in a house with indoor plumbing and gaslight fixtures. But Martha had also stopped answering letters 2 years ago, after the third one where Catherine had carefully, delicately mentioned how difficult things had become. Pride had its limits. Apparently Martha's tolerance for poor relations had found hers. She could apply for territorial assistance. There were programs, supposedly, for widows with children. But the paperwork was complicated, and the nearest territorial office was in Cheyenne. 3 days hard travel away, and you needed money just to make the trip to ask for help because you had no money. The logic was circular and suffocating. She could sell the cabin, the land, her last holdings from the life she and Thomas had tried to build. But who would buy it? The land was played out, the cabin half falling down, and the market for failed ranches wasn't exactly booming in a territory where half the settlers were hanging on by their fingernails just like she was. The wind gusted harder and Catherine closed her eyes against it. Against the sting, against the simple physical fact of her situation pressing down like thumbs on her windpipe. When she opened them again, the street looked exactly the same, dusty and cold and indifferent, the afternoon sun already starting its slide toward the horizon, promising nightfall and deeper cold and another morning where Micah would wake hungry. She needed to move. Standing here was accomplishing nothing except making her a spectacle for anyone who cared to look. She forced her feet into motion, descending the 3 steps from the porch to the street, each one requiring a conscious act of will. Her boots hit the packed dirt, and she started walking back the way she'd come, toward the edge of town, toward home, toward her son, who would look up from his letters with hope in his eyes and ask if she'd gotten the flour, the salt pork, the beans. What would she tell him? The truth, probably. She'd never lied to Micah, not even when the truth was hard. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He knew things were difficult. He'd learned to be satisfied with less, to not ask for second helpings, to wear shoes until they literally fell apart before mentioning he might need new ones. He'd learned resilience the way children do, by necessity, by having no other choice, by watching his mother do the same thing day after day. But there was a difference between resilience and starvation. There was a difference between making do and having nothing to make do with. "Ma'am?" The voice came from her left, low and careful, and Catherine's head snapped up. She'd been so lost in her spiral of thoughts that she hadn't noticed him. A man leaning against one of the posts supporting the overhang outside the saddlery, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He was tall, rangy in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle, with that particular weathered quality that made exact age hard to guess. Could have been 30, could have been 45. His coat was worn but clean, his boots scuffed but well-maintained. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a few days' worth of stubble on his jaw, and eyes that were kind. That was the word that came to her. Kind. Not pitying, not calculating, just kind. Catherine stopped walking, realized she was clutching her empty basket against her chest like a shield. "Yes?" "Forgive me for overstepping," the man said, straightening from the post but not moving toward her, respecting distance. "But I was in Morrison's just now. Heard what happened." Heat flooded Catherine's face, shame, swift and total. Of course he'd heard. Everyone had heard. That was the point of Morrison saying it so loud, to make sure everyone knew, to prevent her from trying the same thing at every store in town. "Then you'll understand why I'm not in the mood for conversation." "I understand why you'd feel that way," the man agreed, his tone even, no judgment in it. "I also understand what it's like to be hungry, what it's like to watch someone you care about be hungry and not be able to fix it." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. There was a weight there, a history. This wasn't some comfortable townsman offering cheap sympathy. This was someone who knew, who'd been there. "What do you want?" she asked, and heard how harsh it came out, how defensive. "Nothing," he said simply. "I want to help." "You got turned away for food?" When she nodded stiffly, he continued. "Come with me. I'll fill your table tonight." Catherine stared at him, trying to process the words, trying to figure out the angle. Nobody did something for nothing, especially not for a woman alone. There was always a cost, always an expectation. "I don't even know you." "Name's Silas Whitlow," he said. "I'm a drover. Been moving cattle up from Texas, just finished a drive, got paid out. Staying at the boarding house on 5th Street for a few days before I head back south." He paused, seemed to choose his next words carefully. "I don't want anything from you, ma'am. No expectations. He gestured vaguely, as if trying to grasp something invisible. "I can't walk past someone who needs help when I'm able to give it. My conscience won't let me. Simple as that." It wasn't simple. Nothing was ever simple. Catherine's mind raced through possibilities, through dangers, through every cautionary tale her mother had ever told her about men and their intentions. But underneath the fear and the suspicion was something else. A bone-deep exhaustion with being afraid, with being suspicious, with being alone in every decision and every struggle. And beneath that, even deeper, hunger. Real, physical, gnawing hunger. The kind that made you lightheaded. The kind that made Micah's ribs show through his nightshirt. "I have a son," she heard herself say. Testing. Warning. "I figured," Silas said. "Heard you mention a boy to Morrison." He pushed away from the post, moved a few steps closer, but still maintaining respectful distance. "Look, Mrs. Hale, Catherine Hale. Mrs. Hale. I know how this looks. Stranger offering charity can seem like there's strings attached. So here's what I propose. I buy the food, enough for a good supper and then some. You take it home, feed your boy, feed yourself. I don't come inside. I don't ask for thanks. I just tip my hat and ride off. And you never see me again." He met her eyes, his own steady and honest. No strings, no obligations. Just a man who got lucky this month helping someone who didn't. Catherine wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it. The same pride that had kept her chin up walking out of Morrison's, that had kept her from completely falling apart a dozen times over the past 2 years, that was maybe the only thing she had left that was truly hers. But pride didn't feed Micah. Pride didn't keep the cold out or put wood on the fire. Pride was a luxury, and she'd run out of those a long time ago. "Why?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. "Why would you do this?" Silas was quiet for a moment, his gaze sliding past her to something in the distance, something she couldn't see. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, rougher. "Had a sister once. She found herself in a similar situation. Husband dead, kids to feed, nowhere to turn. I was on a drive, didn't even know things had gotten so bad. By the time I got back—" He stopped, swallowed. "By the time I got back, she'd done what she felt she had to do to keep her kids alive. Things she shouldn't have had to do. Things that broke something in her." He looked back at Catherine, and she saw it then. Old pain, old guilt, the kind that never fully healed. "I wasn't there when she needed me. Can't change that. But I can be here now, for someone else who needs help. Maybe that don't make sense to you. Maybe it's just me trying to balance some cosmic ledger that can't be balanced. But it's the truth." The wind blew between them, carrying the promise of snow and the smell of wood smoke from chimneys in town. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. A wagon rattled past, the driver nodding at them in that casual way frontier people acknowledged each other. Catherine made her decision. "All right," she said. Then, stronger, "All right. Thank you, Mr. Whitlow." "Silas," he corrected gently. "And it's me should be thanking you for letting me help. Sounds backward, I know, but there it is." He gestured toward the general store. "Shall we?" They walked back to Morrison's together, and Catherine felt the weight of eyes on them from every window, every doorway. By tomorrow morning, it would be all over town. Catherine Hale walking back into Morrison's with a strange man, the two of them emerging with packages. The gossip would be vicious and immediate. She could almost hear it. What did she do to earn that? What did she promise him? Shameful, really, a woman with a child carrying on with a cowboy she just met. Let them talk. Let them think what they would. Her son would eat tonight. That was what mattered. Inside the store, Morrison's eyes widened almost comically when he saw her return, saw the man beside her. Silas stepped up to the counter with easy confidence, a man used to conducting business, used to being taken seriously. "Need to purchase some supplies," he said, his tone pleasant but firm. "Flour, 20 pounds. Salt pork, 10 pounds. Beans, coffee, sugar, dried apples if you've got them. Molasses, cornmeal, salt, baking powder." He glanced at Catherine. "What else?" She'd been standing there in a kind of daze, hardly believing this was happening. "Lard," she managed, and maybe some eggs, if they're not too dear?" 2 dozen eggs," Silas said to Morrison without hesitation. "And throw in some of those peppermint sticks in the jar there. Every kid should have peppermint." Morrison's face had gone through several expressions during this recitation. Surprise, calculation, and now a kind of obsequious pleasure that came from watching a certain-to-be profitable transaction unfold. "Of course, Mr. Whitlow, and I'll pay cash." Silas pulled out a leather wallet from inside his coat, and Catherine saw the glint of paper money, real money, not scrip or promises. Morrison saw it too, and his smile became genuinely warm in the way it never had been for Catherine alone. "Right away, Mr. Whitlow. This'll just take a few minutes to package up." They waited while Morrison and his clerk bustled around, pulling items from shelves, weighing, wrapping, calculating. Other customers drifted in and out, their conversation stopping when they saw Catherine, starting up again in whispers when they thought she couldn't hear. She kept her eyes forward, kept her expression neutral, and tried not to think about what all this food was costing, how much Silas was spending on strangers, on a woman and child he didn't know and would likely never see again. When Morrison tallied it all up, the total was $23, more than Catherine had seen in one place in months, enough to keep her and Micah fed for weeks, maybe a month, if she was careful. Silas counted out the bills without blinking, added an extra $1. "For your trouble." "No trouble at all, sir," Morrison said, pocketing the money with practiced ease. "Pleasure doing business with you." The packages were considerable, too much for Catherine to carry alone. Silas gathered most of them easily, left her with just her basket now filled with the eggs, carefully packed in straw. They walked out together into the late afternoon, and Catherine felt something in her chest unknot slightly, just slightly, for the first time in days. Outside, Silas headed toward a horse tied up near the saloon, a good-looking chestnut gelding with intelligent eyes. He loaded the packages into his saddlebags and behind his saddle with the efficiency of long practice, then turned to Catherine. "Where's home?" She hesitated one more time, that ingrained caution rising up, telling a stranger where she lived, leading him there. Every story of violence and violation she'd ever heard whispered in the back of her mind. But she looked at his face, at the steady kindness there, at the way he'd spent nearly a month's wages for some people without a second thought, and she made herself trust, made herself take the risk. 2 miles west, she said, near Goose Creek. Little cabin with a split-rail fence. I'll ride alongside you, Silas said. Not presuming to invite myself in, just making sure you get home safe with all this. He swung up into the saddle with easy grace, settled the reins, and looked down at her. Ready when you are. They set out, Catherine walking, Silas riding slow beside her, matching his horse's pace to hers. For a while neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just two people sharing space, the creak of saddle leather, and the crunch of boots on the road the only sounds besides the wind. It was Silas who broke it first. How long you been out here? 5 years, Catherine said. Came west with my husband. He wanted to ranch, thought he could make something of himself away from his family's shadow back in Indiana. She smiled without humor. Turns out ranching is harder than wanting to ranch. Usually is, Silas agreed. Takes capital most folks don't have. Land, cattle, water rights, hands to work it. Easy to get in over your head. That's what happened to Thomas. Everything that could go wrong did. Drought, disease, cattle prices dropping. We lost more and more every year until there wasn't anything left to lose except the cabin and the plot it sits on. She shifted the basket to her other arm. He took sick that last winter, pneumonia. Couldn't afford a doctor, couldn't afford medicine. He died in March, right when the snow was melting. I'm sorry, Silas said, and it sounded like he meant it. Not the reflexive condolence people offered because they had to, but genuine sympathy. Micah was 4, Catherine continued, not sure why she was telling him all this, only that the words wanted out after being held in so long. He doesn't remember much of his father now, just impressions. I try to keep Thomas alive for him with stories, but I don't know if that's enough. Don't know if I'm enough. You're still here, Silas said quietly. Still fighting. That's more than enough. That's everything. They walked on. The town fell away behind them, the scattered buildings giving way to open land brown and sere with approaching winter. The sky was darkening, the sun a cold disk sinking toward distant mountains. Catherine's feet ached, her arms ached, but there was food in her basket, and more food coming behind her, and for this moment, that was enough. The cabin came into view as they rounded a bend, small and weathered, its roof patched in places, its walls chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and gray. Micah had kept the fire going. Good boy. As they approached, the door flew open and Micah came running out, barefoot despite the cold, his face bright with excitement that dimmed to caution when he saw the stranger on horseback. Mama! He ran to her, wrapped his arms around her waist, looked up with those 2 old eyes. Did you get food? I did, baby, Catherine said, her throat tight. This is Mr. Whitlow. He helped us. Micah looked at Silas with the wariness of a child who'd learned that strangers could mean trouble. Hello. Hello yourself, Silas said, dismounting. He crouched down to be closer to eye level with the boy, a gesture Catherine noticed and filed away. Respectful, kind. You like rabbit stew? Micah's eyes went huge. Yes, sir. Good, because I noticed your mama didn't get any meat at the store, and a boy your age needs protein. Tell you what, you see that stand of cottonwoods down by the creek? Micah nodded. I bet there's rabbits in there. What say tomorrow morning? If your mama says it's all right, you and I go hunting. I'll show you how to set snares, and whatever we catch, we cook up for supper. Really? Micah's face transformed, became the face of a child given an unhoped-for present. Mama, can I? Catherine looked at Silas, who stood and met her gaze steadily. Still no expectations in his eyes. Still no hidden agenda that she could detect. Just a man offering to teach her son something useful, offering to provide more than just tonight's meal. We'll see, she said carefully. Let's get this food inside first before it freezes. They unloaded everything, Silas carrying the heavier packages up to the cabin door, but, true to his word, not presuming to enter. He stacked them neatly on the porch, tipped his hat to Catherine, and was preparing to leave when Micah's voice stopped him. "Mr. Whitlow, will you really come back tomorrow?" Silas looked at the boy, then at Catherine. She could see the question in his eyes, seeking permission, making sure he wasn't overstepping. Something in her, some last wall of resistance, crumbled. "If you come," she said quietly, "come for breakfast. It's the least I can do." A slow smile spread across Silas's face, transforming it, making him look younger. "I'd be honored, ma'am. Sunrise?" "Sunrise," she confirmed. He mounted his horse, gave them a small salute, and rode off into the gathering dusk. Catherine and Micah stood watching until he disappeared around the bend, then looked at each other. "Is he going to be my new papa?" Micah asked with the blunt directness of children. "No, baby," Catherine said, though something in her chest twisted at the question. "He's just a kind man helping us out." "But he might come back?" "He might." "Good," Micah said decisively. "I like him." Catherine ushered her son inside, closed the door against the cold, and surveyed their sudden wealth of food with something approaching disbelief. Flour, real flour, white and fine. Salt pork that would render down into fat for cooking, beans and coffee and sugar and all the things they'd been doing without. And peppermint sticks. 3 of them, red and white striped, tucked into the corner of one package. She gave one to Micah, who clutched it like treasure, and allowed herself one moment, just one, to lean against the wall and close her eyes and breathe. They would eat tonight. They would eat tomorrow. They would be all right, at least for now. When she opened her eyes, Micah was looking at her with concern. "Are you crying, Mama?" "No, baby," she said, wiping at her face quickly. "Just tired. Come on, let's make supper." They cooked together in the small space, Catherine teaching Micah how to measure flour properly, how to mix biscuits so they'd rise light and fluffy. The cabin filled with warmth and good smells, and when they finally sat down to eat, biscuits with butter and molasses, fried salt pork, coffee for her, and milk for Micah that one of the packages had miraculously contained. It felt like a feast. Micah ate until his stomach was round, then curled up by the fire with his peppermint stick, contentment radiating from every line of his small body. Catherine cleaned up slowly, methodically, her mind turning over the day's events, trying to make sense of Silas Whitlow and his unexpected generosity. What did he want? What did he really want? Maybe nothing. Maybe exactly what he'd said, just to help because he could, because someone he'd loved hadn't received help when she'd needed it. Maybe some people were just kind. The thought was strange and uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit. Catherine had spent so long expecting the worst, bracing for the next blow, that simple kindness felt almost suspicious in its rarity. But as she banked the fire for the night and tucked Micah into bed and lay down on her own narrow cot, full for the first time in days, she let herself wonder. Let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to not be alone, to have someone who helped shoulder the burden, to trust again. Tomorrow would tell. Tomorrow Silas would either return as he'd promised, or he wouldn't. Either way, they'd eaten tonight. Either way, she'd survived another day. Either way, she was still here, still fighting, still enough. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin's corners, and the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the hard ground with something like grace. Catherine woke before dawn to the sound of hoofbeats. For a moment, disoriented in the gray pre-morning light, she thought she'd imagined them, a dream bleeding into waking. Then she heard them again, steady and deliberate, coming closer. Her heart jumped into her throat as she threw off her blanket and moved to the window, pulling aside the flour sack curtain just enough to peer out. Silas Whitlow sat astride his chestnut gelding in the yard, his breath and the horses forming clouds in the frigid air. He hadn't dismounted yet, as if waiting for some sign that he was truly welcome, that his presence at this hour wasn't an intrusion. The sky behind him was beginning to lighten at the edges, streaks of pale gold and rose cutting through the darkness, and snow covered everything. Not deep, just an inch or two, enough to muffle sound and make the world look clean and new. He'd come back. He'd actually come back. Catherine became suddenly, acutely aware of her appearance, hair loose and tangled from sleep, still wearing the worn cotton nightgown she'd owned since before Thomas died, face unwashed. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman barely surviving, too exhausted most days to care about niceties like grooming. For the first time in months, maybe years, she cared. "Micah," she whispered urgently, moving to her son's cot and shaking his shoulder gently. "Micah, wake up. Mr. Whitlow's here." The boy's eyes opened instantly, no gradual waking for him. Life on the edge had taught him to come alert quickly. "He came? He really came. He really came. Now get dressed quickly while I—" She looked down at herself, felt heat rise in her cheeks. "While I make myself presentable." She moved behind the sheet they'd strung across one corner of the cabin for privacy and changed as quickly as her cold, stiff fingers would allow. Her best dress, which wasn't saying much, a gray wool that had been patched at the elbows and let out at the seams more times than she could count. She ran her fingers through her hair, working out the worst of the tangles, and twisted it into a simple bun at the nape of her neck. No mirror to check her reflection, but it would have to do. When she emerged, Micah was already dressed and practically vibrating with excitement at the door. Catherine took a breath to steady herself, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and opened it. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing her breath, but Celis's smile was warm enough to offset it. He dismounted and stood a respectful distance from the door, hat in hand, looking somehow both comfortable and uncertain. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he said. "Hope I'm not too early." "You're right on time," Catherine replied, and was grateful her voice came out steady. "Come in, please, before you freeze out there." He climbed the 2 steps to the porch, stomped the snow from his boots with the automatic courtesy of a man raised properly, and ducked through the doorway. The cabin, already small, seemed to shrink further with him in it, not in a threatening way, but in an awareness way. Suddenly, Catherine was conscious of every shabby corner, every patched curtain, every sign of their poverty on full display. If Celis noticed, he gave no indication. His eyes swept the space once, taking it in, then settled on Micah with that same kind expression he'd worn yesterday. "Morning, young man. You ready to learn some hunting after we eat?" "Yes, sir." Micah bounced on his toes. "Mama said you'd teach me to set snares." "That I will. But first," he looked at Catherine, "your mama's going to feed us breakfast, and we're going to be appreciative and well-mannered about it. Agreed?" "Agreed," Micah said solemnly, in a tone that suggested this was a sacred pact. Catherine moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands, some task to focus on besides the strange awareness of this man in her space. She built up the fire, set the kettle on for coffee, began mixing batter for Johnny cakes with the cornmeal and eggs from yesterday's supplies. Her movements were practiced, efficient, the result of thousands of mornings doing this same work. Behind her, she heard Celis settle into one of the 2 chairs at their small table, heard Micah climb into his lap without invitation or hesitation, the way children did when they recognized someone safe. The ease of it made her throat tight. "So what else you been learning besides letters?" Celis asked, his voice low and conversational. "Numbers," Micah said proudly. "And some history. Mama teaches me every day, even when she's tired." "Education's important," Celis agreed. "Man can lose everything in this life, money, land, livestock, but nobody can take away what's in his head. You remember that." "I will," Micah promised. Then, with the bluntness of a 6-year-old, "Are you going to marry my mama?" Catherine nearly dropped the bowl she was holding. Heat flooded her face, and she spun around, mouth open to apologize, to explain that children had no filter, that he shouldn't. But Celis was laughing, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement, his hand resting easy on Micah's shoulder. "Well now, that's a mighty direct question. I've known your mama for all of 1 day, so I'd say marriage is getting a bit ahead of ourselves, don't you think?" "Papa died when I was little," Micah said matter-of-factly. "Mama gets lonely sometimes. I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep." "Micah Thomas Hale," Catherine said sharply, mortification complete. "That's private, and you know better than to—" "It's all right," Celis interrupted gently, meeting her eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, no discomfort, just understanding. "Boy's just looking out for his mama. That's admirable. He shifted Micah slightly so he could look at him directly. Tell you what, I can't promise marriage to anyone I just met. That wouldn't be right or honest. But I can promise friendship. And friends help each other look out for each other. That sound fair? Micah considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Friends is good, he finally decided. We don't have many of those. Well, now you've got one more, Silas said firmly. He glanced up at Catherine. If that's acceptable to your mama, of course. What could she say? No, we don't need friends. We're better off alone with our pride and our empty cupboards. She'd already accepted his help, had already let him into her home. Refusing friendship now would be not just rude, but stupid. It's acceptable, she said quietly, then turned back to the stove before he could see whatever expression was on her face. They ate as the sun rose fully, light streaming through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The Johnny cakes were good, better than good, because Catherine had been able to use real eggs and enough fat to fry them properly, instead of the burnt dry things they'd been choking down for weeks. Silas ate with the steady appreciation of a man who'd missed plenty of meals in his life and didn't take full plates for granted. He complimented the cooking, teased Micah about eating so fast he'd hardly tasted it, and helped clear the table after without being asked. You don't have to do that, Catherine protested when he started pumping water into the basin for washing. I know, he said simply, but my mama raised me to clean up after myself, and that training stuck. He glanced at her. Besides, many hands make light work. Isn't that how the saying goes? It was, though Catherine hadn't experienced the truth of it in so long she'd almost forgotten. But watching him wash while she dried, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, she remembered what it had been like when Thomas was alive. How they'd worked together. How the burden of daily existence had been lighter when it was shared. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed that until this moment. All right, Silas said when the last dish was put away. He looked at Micah. Ready for your hunting lesson? Micah shot off his chair like he'd been launched from a cannon. Can I really come, Mama? Can I? Catherine wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, suddenly reluctant to let her son out of her sight, to trust him to this near stranger despite how kind he'd been. What if something happened? What if Silas wasn't who he seemed? What if... Mrs. Hale. Silas's voice was gentle but direct. I give you my word I'll bring him back safe. We won't go far, just down to the creek. You can watch from here if you want, and I'll teach him proper safety, how to handle snares so he don't hurt himself, how to read tracks, useful things. She looked at her son's eager face, at the hope and excitement there, emotions she saw far too rarely these days. Looked at Silas, at his steady, honest eyes, made her decision. All right, but Micah, you listen to Mr. Whitlow, understand? Do exactly what he says. I will, Mama, I promise. Micah was already pulling on his coat, the one with patches on patches, struggling with buttons in his haste. Here, Silas crouched down, helped fasten the buttons with patient hands. Can't have you freezing out there. You got gloves? They got holes, Micah admitted. Well, we'll just have to keep moving then. Keep the blood flowing. Come on. Catherine stood in the doorway watching them go. Two figures, one tall, one small, making their way through the snow toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek. Silas kept his pace slow, matching Micah's shorter stride, and she could see him talking, gesturing, pointing things out. Teaching. When they disappeared into the trees, she closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. The cabin felt empty without Micah's chatter, without another adult presence. Just her and the quiet and the endless list of things that needed doing. But for once, she didn't immediately launch into work. Instead, she moved to the window and watched the tree line, waiting, worrying, hoping. An hour passed, then another. Catherine mended clothes, trying not to watch the weak winter sun track across the sky, trying not to imagine every terrible possibility. She'd just about convinced herself to go down to the creek to check on them when the door burst open and Micah tumbled in, red-cheeked and breathless with excitement. Mama, we got three rabbits, and Mr. Whitlow let me help skin them, and he showed me how to tell which tracks are fresh and which are old. And did you know rabbits sleep with their eyes open sometimes? And, breathe, child, Catherine laughed, catching him before he could launch into more. Behind him, Silas entered more sedately, carrying the dressed rabbits by their back legs. Boy's a natural, he said, setting the rabbits on the table. Good hands, good eyes, listen to instruction. You've raised him well. The praise warmed her more than it should have. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to be a hunter, Micah announced. Mr. Whitlow said if I practice, I can help feed us. That's a good skill to have, Catherine agreed. She looked at the rabbits, at the promise of meat for several meals, and felt that knot in her chest loosen another degree. And generous of Mr. Whitlow to teach you. Silas, he corrected again. And it was my pleasure. He's a good student. He glanced toward the door. I should probably head back to town. Let you folks have your day. Wait, Catherine heard herself say. Stay for lunch. It's the least. You brought the rabbits, and it doesn't feel right for you to leave without. She was fumbling the words, unused to extending invitations, unused to wanting someone to stay. Silas's expression softened. You sure? Don't want to impose. You're not imposing, she said firmly. Micah, go fetch more water from the well. Carefully, mind the ice. When Micah had gone, bundled against the cold and taking the bucket with both hands, Silas moved closer. Not inappropriately close, but near enough that she could see the snowflakes caught in his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind. Mrs. Hale, Catherine, if I may, I want you to know I meant what I said yesterday. No expectations. I help because I want to, because it's the right thing, not because I'm looking for anything in return. She met his eyes, searching for deception and finding none. Why? And don't tell me again about your sister. There's more to it than that. Nobody's this kind without reason. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. Spent most of my life on cattle drives, moving herds from Texas up to Kansas, Wyoming, Montana. Hard work, dangerous work. But it felt important. Felt like I was building something, Even if it was just building a reputation as a reliable drover. He paused, rubbed the back of his neck. Few years back, I was ramrodding a drive up the Chisholm Trail. Had a young hand, maybe 17, kid from Arkansas, looking to make his fortune. Good worker, eager to learn. One night we had a stampede. Lightning spooked the herd. Kid went after strays, got thrown from his horse, trampled. Catherine's breath caught. Took him 3 days to die, Silas continued, his voice flat now, recounting facts to keep emotion at bay. Couldn't get him to a doctor, too far from anywhere. Just had to watch him suffer, listen to him call for his mama. When it was over, I went through his things to send back to his family. Found letters. Turns out his mama was a widow, he was her only child, and he'd been sending most of his pay home to keep her fed. I sent her what he'd earned plus my own wages for that drive. Wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough. He finally looked at her again. So when I see someone struggling, someone who reminds me of that boy's mama, or my sister, or any of the dozen other people I've known who got dealt a bad hand through no fault of their own, I help if I can. Maybe it's selfish. Maybe I'm just trying to balance the scales, make up for the times I couldn't help. But it's what I do. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. That's not selfish. That's just human, decent, more than most people manage. Most people are just trying to survive, Silas said quietly. Can't fault them for not having extra to give, but I do have extra right now, and you need it, so... He shrugged. Simple math. The door banged open and Micah staggered in with the water bucket, sloshing slightly. Got it, Mama. Good boy, Catherine said, her voice rough. She cleared her throat. Now go wash your hands while I start on lunch. They ate together again, rabbit stewed with the last of their potatoes and some of the dried vegetables from Silas's purchases. The meat was lean and gamey, but after weeks of near starvation, it tasted like a feast. Micah talked nonstop through the meal, recounting every detail of the morning's hunt, his hands gesturing wildly as he described how the snare had worked, how quick Silas had been with the knife. Silas listened with patient attention, asking questions, encouraging the boys' enthusiasm. Catherine watched them together and felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, Hope, maybe, or longing. The desire for this to be permanent, for this table to always have 3 people around it instead of 2. For Micah to always have a man to teach him and guide him. For her to have what? Companionship? Partnership? More? She pushed the thoughts away. This was temporary. Celis had made that clear. He was here for a few days, then heading back to Texas. This kindness was a gift, not a promise of anything lasting. She needed to remember that, needed to protect herself and Micah from hoping for more than reality would provide. After lunch, Celis surprised them both by pulling out a harmonica from his coat pocket. "You like music?" he asked Micah. "Don't know much music," the boy admitted. "Mama sings sometimes, but we don't have any instruments." "Well then, let me teach you a song or two." Celis played a few notes, testing, then launched into a lively tune that had Micah clapping along almost immediately. Catherine found herself smiling despite her earlier melancholy, watching her son's face light up with joy. When Celis finished, Micah begged, "Another one! Play another!" "All right, but this one's slower, more of a thinking song." He played something softer, sadder, a melody that spoke of long trails and distant homes and the loneliness of the open range. Catherine felt it settle into her bones, this musical expression of feelings she'd never quite found words for. When the last note faded, the cabin was quiet. Micah had curled up on his cot, exhausted from the morning's excitement, and the full belly, a combination he wasn't used to. His eyes were already drooping. "I should let you both rest," Celis said, standing. "Been a long morning." "Will you come back?" The question was out before Catherine could stop it, too eager, too revealing. But Celis just smiled. "If you'll have me. Got a few more days before I need to head south. Seems a shame to spend them all at the boarding house when there's work to be done here." "Work?" Catherine frowned. "I don't expect you to eat." "That fence of yours is about to fall down," he interrupted gently. "And your roof's got some weak spots that'll cause trouble when the real snow hits. Your door sticks something fierce, and the barn, if you can call it that, is in even worse shape." He held up a hand when she opened her mouth to protest. "I know you didn't ask, but I'm a fair hand at repairs, and I'd feel better knowing you and the boy are secure before I leave." "I can't pay you," she said quietly, shame heating her cheeks. "Didn't ask you to. Consider it payment for the meals and the company. Fair trade." It wasn't fair trade, and they both knew it, but Catherine was learning that Celis didn't argue when his mind was made up. And truthfully, the cabin did need work, desperately needed it, in ways she couldn't manage alone. Pride was one thing. Freezing to death because the roof leaked was another. "All right," she agreed, "but only if you'll let me help. I'm stronger than I look, and I won't have you thinking I'm lazy." His smile was warm enough to thaw the ice outside. "Never thought that for a second. Tomorrow morning, then? I'll bring my tools." Tomorrow morning. He left shortly after, once Micah had fallen fully asleep and Catherine had wrapped the leftover rabbit in cloth for their supper. She walked him to the door, watched him mount his horse with that same easy grace she'd noticed before. "Catherine," he said, looking down at her from the saddle. The use of her first name sent a small shock through her system. "Thank you for trusting me with your boy today. I know that wasn't easy." "You brought him back safe," she said simply. "That's all that matters." "I'll always bring him back safe," Celis said, and it sounded like a vow. Then he was riding off, horse's hooves muffled in the snow, leaving her standing in the doorway wondering what, exactly, she'd gotten herself into. The next 3 days fell into a pattern that was simultaneously strange and comfortable. Celis arrived each morning at dawn, shared breakfast with them, then spent the day working on the seemingly endless list of repairs the cabin and surrounding structures needed. Catherine worked alongside him, handing him tools, holding boards steady, learning by watching. Micah helped when he could and played when he couldn't, his laughter a constant backdrop to the work. They spoke as they labored, not constantly, but in comfortable bursts. Celis told stories about cattle drives, about the places he'd been and the people he'd met, about dust storms on the plains and rivers running too high to cross, and the particular madness of trying to bed down 2,000 head of anxious longhorns during a thunderstorm. Catherine found herself laughing at his dry delivery, at the absurdity of some situations, at the way he could find humor even in hardship. In turn, she told him about Indiana, about growing up the youngest of 5 children in a household that never quite had enough of anything, about learning to make do, to stretch supplies, to find joy in small things, about meeting Thomas at a church social and thinking he was the most sophisticated man she'd ever met because he'd been to Chicago once, about the dreams they'd had for their Western adventure and how reality had fallen so short of imagination. "Doesn't mean the dreams were foolish," Silas said, hammering a nail into a new fence post with precise strikes. "Sometimes timing's just wrong, or luck doesn't hold. Doesn't diminish the courage it took to try. Felt foolish when I was standing over my husband's grave with a 4-year-old and $50 to my name," Catherine replied, holding the next post steady. "Felt foolish," Silas agreed, "but wasn't. There's a difference." He paused, wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "You're still here, still fighting. That takes more courage than the initial dream did." On the 4th morning, Catherine woke to silence. No hoofbeats. She told herself it was early yet, that Silas would come, that he'd promised, and he seemed like a man who kept his promises. But as the sun rose fully and the morning stretched on, she felt something sink in her chest. He wasn't coming. Of course he wasn't. Why would he? He'd done his good deed, eased his conscience, and now he was moving on. That was how the world worked. People left. They always left, one way or another. She was feeding Micah a quiet breakfast, both of them subdued when the knock came. Catherine's heart leaped stupidly, and she forced herself to walk, not run, to the door. Silas stood there, but something was different. His face was serious, almost troubled, and he held his hat in both hands like a schoolboy called before the teacher. "Morning," he said. "Can I come in? Need to talk to you about something." Fear spiked through her. This was it. The goodbye, the explanation of why he couldn't keep coming around, the gentle letdown. She stepped aside mutely, let him enter. Micah, oblivious to adult undercurrents, bounded over. "Mr. Whitlow, are we working on the barn today? You said we might." "In a bit, son," Silas said gently. "First I need to talk to your mama. Why don't you go practice your letters for a while?" Micah looked between them, sensing something, but obeyed with unusual docility. When he'd settled at the table with his slate, Silas turned to Catherine. "I need to ask you something," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "I've been thinking about my drive schedule, about what I'm going back to in Texas." Catherine braced herself. "Thing is," he continued, "I've been droving for 15 years. Good money when the drives are successful, but it's a young man's game. I'm 38 years old, and I can feel it. The toll it takes, sleeping on the ground, eating dust, the danger. Lost too many friends to stampedes and river crossings and simple bad luck." He moved to the window, looked out at the land surrounding her cabin. "I've saved most of what I've made. Got enough to buy into a small operation, maybe start a horse ranch. Been thinking about settling somewhere, putting down roots. But I never had reason enough to do it. Never had anyone waiting for me anywhere. So what was the point?" He turned back to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "These past few days, I've been happier than I can remember being in years. Working with my hands on something that matters, sitting down to meals with people I care about, having a reason to wake up beyond just making wages. And I keep thinking, what if I didn't go back?" "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "What if I stayed?" Silas said, the words coming faster now. "Not here exactly. I know you've got your pride, and I'm not suggesting charity. But what if I bought some land nearby, started that horse ranch I've been thinking about? I could help you with the heavy work around here, teach Micah things he needs to know, and we could—" He paused, swallowed. "We could see where things go, between us. If you're interested in there being an us." Catherine's mind was reeling. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know you're strong and proud and good. I know you love your son more than your own life. I know you laugh at my terrible jokes, and you work harder than most men I've known. I know when I think about riding away from here, something in my chest aches." He took a step closer. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Catherine. I'm just asking for the chance to stay, to court you properly, to build something together, if you're willing." "I don't have anything to offer you," she said, and hated how her voice shook. I'm broken. You're everything," Silas interrupted fiercely. "You're everything I've been looking for without knowing I was looking. Please, Just say I can stay. Say I can try. Catherine looked at him. At this man who'd walked into her life 4 days ago and turned it upside down, who'd fed her son and fixed her home and looked at her like she was precious. Thought about saying no. About protecting herself from the inevitable hurt when things fell apart. Thought about saying yes. About the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe things wouldn't fall apart, that maybe this was exactly what it seemed to be. From the table, Micah's voice piped up, "Say yes, Mama." They both turned to look at him. He was supposed to be doing letters, but he was watching them with those two old eyes that saw everything. "He makes you smile," Micah said simply. "And he fixed my coat buttons. And he's teaching me to hunt. Say yes." Catherine looked back at Silas, at the hope and vulnerability in his face, and made her choice. Made her leap. "Yes," she said. "Stay. Please stay." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, took her hands in his, and raised them to his lips. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly, and it made her feel like something rare and valuable. "You won't regret this," he promised. "I better not," she replied, but she was smiling too, couldn't seem to stop smiling. From the table came a whoop of joy, and then Micah was there, hugging both their legs, chattering about all the things they could do now, all the ways everything was going to be better. Catherine let one hand slip from Silas's grip so she could rest it on her son's head, let herself stand there in the warmth of this moment, this promise, this beginning. Outside, the snow had started falling again, but inside the cabin, everything was warm. The decision made, Silas wasted no time putting his plan into motion. That very afternoon, he rode into Sheridan to meet with the land office agent, leaving Catherine and Micah to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The cabin felt different somehow, charged with possibility, as if the air itself had changed composition. "Is Mr. Whitlow really staying, Mama?" Micah asked for the 3rd time, as if repetition would make the miracle more real. "He's really staying," Catherine confirmed, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary, working out the nervous energy that hummed through her veins. "Or at least he's going to try. He needs to find land, start his ranch. That takes time." "But he'll come back tonight?" "I don't know, baby. He's got business to attend to." She tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. Already she was listening for hoofbeats, watching the window, acting like some foolish girl instead of a grown woman who should know better than to get her hopes up so quickly. But when dusk fell and she heard that now familiar sound of his horse approaching, relief flooded through her so intensely it was almost painful. She forced herself to finish shaping the loaf she was working on, to wash her hands calmly, to walk, not run, to the door. Silas dismounted with the loose-limbed ease of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it, but his face was alight with something between triumph and disbelief. "Found it," he called out, his voice carrying in the cold evening air. "Found the perfect piece of land." Catherine stepped onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "Already? That was fast." "Lucky timing," he said, climbing the steps. "The Jacobson place. You know it? About 3 miles north of here, up near the foothills?" She nodded slowly. The Jacobsons had been an older couple, childless, trying to make a go of ranching. She'd heard through town gossip that they'd given up last spring and gone back east to live with his brother's family. "That's good land. Water rights to the creek, some timber, decent grazing." "Exactly. And the bank's been sitting on it since they left, eager to sell. Agent showed me the boundaries, 160 acres, cabin needs work, but it's structurally sound, barns in better shape than yours." He grinned. "No offense." "None taken. My barn's barely standing." She found herself smiling back, caught up in his enthusiasm despite her ingrained caution. "But land like that must cost—" "More than I've got liquid," he admitted. "But I can put down a substantial deposit, enough to secure it, and I've got a buyer lined up for my share in a cattle operation down in San Antonio. Wire should come through in a week or 2. Until then, the bank's willing to hold it for me?" It was happening, really happening. This man she'd known for less than a week was rearranging his entire life, planting roots in Wyoming territory because of what? Some meals and conversation? The possibility of something more with a broke widow and her son? "Silas," she said carefully, "are you sure about this?" I mean, really sure? Because if you're doing this just because you feel obligated, or because of some misplaced sense of, Catherine, he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the absolute certainty in his eyes. I haven't been sure about anything in my life the way I'm sure about this. About you. About staying. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one calloused hand. I know it seems fast. I know you probably think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But I'm also right. I feel it in my bones. This is where I'm supposed to be. She let herself lean into his touch, just slightly, just enough to communicate that she felt it too, this pull between them that defied logic and timeline. People are going to talk. Let them talk. They'll say I'm a gold digger, that I trapped you somehow. Then they'd be fools, and I don't much care what fools think. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, gentle and reverent. Anyone with eyes can see you're not that kind of woman. You're the kind who'd rather starve than ask for help, which is exactly why you needed someone too stubborn to take no for an answer. Despite herself, Catherine laughed, a small huff of breath that clouded in the frigid air. You are that. Stubborn. Takes one to know one, he countered, and before she could respond, Micah's voice cut through the moment. Are you going to kiss her? He called from the doorway, where he'd apparently been watching the entire exchange. Papa used to kiss Mama all the time before he got sick. Silas dropped his hand, stepped back, but his eyes never left Catherine's face. Not yet, he said, loud enough for the boy to hear. Gotta court her properly first, but someday, if your mama lets me, I will. The promise in those words sent heat through Catherine's entire body despite the winter cold. She cleared her throat, tried to regain some equilibrium. You haven't eaten. Come in. There's stew. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged that was both exhilarating and terrifying in its domesticity. Celis stayed at the boarding house in town but spent every daylight hour at Catherine's cabin or working on the Jacobson place, his place now, legally, as of 5 days prior when the wire transfer had come through and the deed had been signed. He divided his time between both properties, fixing what needed fixing, preparing for winter, making plans. But the evenings were Catherine's. Theirs, rather, hers and Micah's and Silas's, this little unit they were becoming without quite acknowledging it out loud. They'd eat supper together, talk about the day's work, teach Micah whatever lessons seemed relevant. Celis showed him how to whittle, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to care for tack and tools. Catherine taught them both, because Silas admitted cheerfully that his education had been spotty, about literature, about history, about the wider world beyond Wyoming territory. Sometimes, after Micah had fallen asleep, they'd sit by the fire and just talk, really talk, in the way adults rarely do, about fears and dreams, and the people they'd been before life had worn them down into who they were now. Catherine learned that Silas's father had been a drunk who'd beaten his children until his liver finally gave out when Silas was 16. Learned that his sister, the one who'd struggled after her husband died, had eventually remarried a good man and was happy now, living in Missouri with her 3 daughters. Learned that Silas had been engaged once, years ago, to a girl in Abilene who'd decided at the last minute that she couldn't marry a man who was gone 8 months out of the year, and he couldn't much blame her for it. In turn, she told him about Thomas, the real Thomas, not the sanitized version she presented to the world, how he'd been a dreamer but a terrible businessman, always sure the next venture would be the one that succeeded, always blind to the practical realities that Catherine could see clear as day. How she'd loved him anyway, loved his optimism even as it frustrated her, loved the way he'd believed so completely in impossible things, how his death had been both a tragedy and, if she was being brutally honest, almost a relief, because at least the struggle had an endpoint. At least she could stop waiting for him to somehow save them and focus on saving herself and Micah. Does that make me a terrible person? She asked one night, staring into the fire instead of at Silas. That I was relieved when my husband died? Makes you honest, Silas said quietly, and human. Love doesn't mean you can't also feel other things, frustration, exhaustion, even anger at the situation you're in. Doesn't diminish what you felt for him. I did love him, Catherine insisted, needing him to know that. I really did. I know you did. I can hear it in how you talk about him. Silas shifted in his chair, and she felt his gaze on her profile. Can I ask you something? Always. Do you think you could love again? If the right person came along? Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She finally turned to look at him, found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, hopeful, vulnerable, uncertain. I think, she said slowly, choosing each word with care, that I could, that maybe I already am starting to. The smile that broke across his face was worth every moment of fear it had taken to admit that truth. He reached across the space between their chairs, offered his hand palm up, and Catherine took it. They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands clasped, not speaking, not needing to. The town, predictably, had opinions about the developing situation. Catherine heard the whispers when she went to the general store. Morrison was more polite to her now that she paid in cash money that Silas gave her without her asking, insisting it was rent for meals and company, though they both knew it was more than that. She heard the women murmuring behind their hands, saw the speculative looks and the occasional openly hostile glare from mothers with unmarried daughters who thought Silas Whitlow was quite a catch for a drifting cowboy. Amelia Pritchard was the worst. She cornered Catherine one afternoon outside the post office, her pretty face arranged in an expression of false concern. Mrs. Hale, I hope you don't mind me saying, but people are talking. People always talk, Mrs. Pritchard, Catherine said evenly, trying to step around her. Amelia moved to block her path. Yes, but this is different. A man like Mr. Whitlow, spending so much time at your home, and you a widow with a young child. It's not proper. People worry about what example it sets. Catherine felt anger flare hot in her chest. What people worry about is their own business. Mr. Whitlow has been nothing but respectful and helpful. He's fixing my property and preparing his own ranch. There's nothing improper about it. But surely you can see how it looks, Amelia pressed, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. A woman alone, a strange man showing interest. Some are saying that you've encouraged him inappropriately, that you're trying to trap him into marriage. Then some people are idiots, Catherine said flatly, her patience finally snapping. And if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do instead of standing around gossiping about my neighbors. She pushed past Amelia, trembling with fury and humiliation, and nearly collided with Silas Morrison emerging from his store. He caught her elbow to steady her, then released it quickly, as if burned. Mrs. Hale, he said, his tone careful. Everything all right? Fine, she said shortly, then reconsidered. Morrison was the closest thing this town had to a neutral authority figure. Actually, Mr. Morrison, perhaps you can help settle something. Is there any law or ordinance that prevents a widow from having male visitors at her home? Any regulation that says a single man can't court a single woman in whatever manner they both find appropriate? Morrison's eyebrows rose. No, ma'am. No law against any of that? Why do you ask? Just curious, Catherine said, loudly enough that Amelia, still standing nearby, could hear every word. Since apparently some people in this town believe they're entitled to police other people's personal business, I wanted to make sure I wasn't actually breaking any rules. Good to know I'm not. She walked away before Morrison could respond, her spine straight and her head high, refusing to let them see how much the gossip hurt. Let them talk. Let them whisper and speculate and judge. She was doing nothing wrong, and neither was Celis, and if the good people of Sheridan couldn't accept that, well, she'd survived worse than social disapproval. When she reached her cabin, Silas was there working on replacing rotted boards on the porch. He took one look at her face and set down his hammer. What happened? Nothing, she said automatically, then stopped. They'd promised each other honesty. Town gossips. Apparently we're causing a scandal. His jaw tightened. Who? Does it matter? It's not just one person, it's the general consensus. She sank down on the one stable step, suddenly exhausted. They think I'm trying to trap you, that we're... She couldn't even say it. Silas sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. We could stop them talking real quick, you know. How? We could get married. Catherine's head snapped up. What? Married, he repeated calmly, as if he'd just suggested they have beans for dinner. That's what you wanted to happen eventually anyway, isn't it? What I want. So why wait and let busybodies make us both miserable in the meantime? Because, Catherine floundered, trying to organize her thoughts. Because we've known each other 2 weeks. Because people don't get married that fast. Because it's crazy. My parents knew each other 3 days before they got married, Silas said. Stayed together 40 years until Mama died. Sometimes you just know. He turned to face her fully. I know, Catherine. I know you're who I want to wake up next to. I know I want to raise Micah like my own son. I know I want to build a life here with you, legal and recognized and permanent. Don't you know it too? She did. God help her, she did know. Had known since that first morning when he'd shown up at dawn like he'd promised, had maybe known even earlier than that, standing outside Morrison's store with her empty basket and her shredded pride. This man, this strange and wonderful man, was meant to be hers, was supposed to be here, supposed to stay, supposed to become the foundation of a new life she'd stopped believing was possible. Yes, she whispered, I know it too. Then marry me. Not someday, not eventually. Now. This week. Go into town, talk to the minister, make it legal and binding so nobody can say a damn word about impropriety or scandal or any other garbage they want to make up. Silas, I love you, he said, and the words hit her like a physical blow. I know it's fast. I know it's probably too soon to say it, but I do. I love your strength and your pride and the way you make Micah laugh. I love how you look at the world like it owes you nothing, but you're going to take what you need anyway. I love that you're terrible at accepting help, and that you argue with me when you think I'm wrong, and that you cry when you think nobody's watching. I love you, Catherine Hale, and I want to marry you. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot against the cold skin of her cheeks. I love you too, she managed. I didn't want to. I tried not to, but I do. He cupped her face in both hands, thumbs wiping away her tears. Is that a yes? Will you marry me? Yes, she said, then louder, more certain. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her then, finally, his lips gentle against hers despite the intensity of emotion crackling between them. It was Catherine's first kiss in over 2 years, and it felt like coming home and launching into the unknown all at once. She gripped his coat, held on, let herself fall into the moment without reservation or fear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Micah's voice came from the doorway. Does this mean he's going to be my new papa? They turned to find him standing there, having witnessed the entire exchange, his expression somewhere between excitement and anxiety. Catherine held out her hand and he came immediately, burrowing between them. If you'll have me, Silas said, addressing the boy directly. I'd be honored to be your papa, Micah. I know I can't replace your first father, and I won't try. But I'll do my best to be a good one, to teach you and protect you and love you like my own. That sound acceptable? Micah looked up at Catherine, seeking confirmation that this was real, that it wasn't going to disappear like so many other good things in his short life. She nodded, squeezed his shoulder. Acceptable, Micah declared, then launched himself at Silas with enough force to nearly knock him over. Can I call you Papa now? Silas's eyes went bright with unshed tears. He wrapped his arms around the boy, held him close. You can call me whatever feels right to you, son. Papa, Micah decided firmly. Papa Silas. Catherine watched them together, this man and this boy, forming a bond that was already stronger than blood, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for years finally relax. They were going to be all right, more than all right. They were going to be happy. The wedding took place 4 days later in the small church on the edge of Sheridan, with Reverend Matthews presiding and only a handful of witnesses present. Catherine wore her best dress, still patched at the elbows, but Silas had bought her a length of blue ribbon in town, and she'd woven it through her hair, feeling almost pretty for the first time in years. Silas wore a new shirt, stiff and uncomfortable looking, but his eyes when he looked at her were warm enough to offset any discomfort. Micah stood between them, solemn in the gravity of the moment, holding both their hands. When Reverend Matthews asked who gave this woman to be married, Micah piped up, I do. Me and Papa are both marrying Mama. Scattered laughter from the few people in attendance, Doc Harrison and his wife, the Smithy and his daughter, a couple of Silas's friends from the boarding house. Notably absent were most of the town's prominent families, including Amelia Pritchard and her crowd. Their absence was pointed and deliberate, but Catherine found she didn't care. Let them boycott. Let them disapprove. She was marrying a good man who loved her, who'd rescued her from starvation and despair without asking anything in return. That was worth more than all the social approval in Wyoming territory. Do you, Catherine Marie Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? I do, Catherine said, her voice steady and clear. She meant it with every fiber of her being. And do you, Celis Benjamin Whitlow, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part? I do, Celis said, squeezing her hand. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the Lord above, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Celis leaned in slowly, giving her time to meet him halfway, and when their lips touched this time, it was different. Not the desperate passion of that first kiss on the porch, but something deeper, more solid. A promise and a beginning. When they separated, Micah was grinning wide enough to split his face, and Catherine felt tears on her cheeks again. But these were the good kind, the kind that came from joy instead of grief. They walked out of the church together, a family now in law as well as heart, into bright November sunshine that seemed to bless the occasion despite the cold. Doc Harrison's wife had organized a small gathering at their home. Nothing fancy, just coffee and cake and good wishes. It was more than Catherine had expected, more than she'd felt entitled to hope for. You did good, Catherine, Mrs. Harrison said quietly, pressing a slice of cake into her hands. That's a good man you married. Better than most. I know, Catherine said, watching Celis across the room as he talked with Doc Harrison about livestock prices and grazing rights, Micah hanging on his every word. Celis's place was ready for habitation. They decided to spend the first few months of marriage there, then move to the larger property come spring. Micah was already asleep in Celis's arms, exhausted by the excitement of the day. Inside, Celis laid the boy gently in his cot, covered him with blankets, then turned to Catherine. They stood looking at each other in the firelight, suddenly shy despite everything they had already shared, all the conversations and confessions and promises. So, Celis said quietly, we're married. We're married, Catherine echoed. That happened fast. Too fast? She considered, honest in her evaluation. No, exactly as fast as it needed to. She moved closer, placed her hands flat against his chest, felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palms. I'm still scared, though. Scared this is too good. Scared something will happen to take it away. I'm scared, too, he admitted. Scared I won't be good enough, won't be what you and Micah need. Scared I'll fail you somehow. We'll be scared together then, Catherine decided. And we'll figure it out as we go. That's what partners do, right? Right. He covered her hands with his, held them against his heart. I promise you, Catherine, I'll work every day to be worthy of this, of you. I'll build us a life worth living. I'll keep you safe and warm and as happy as I know how to make you. I promise you the same, she said, even though I don't have much to offer except everything, he interrupted. You're offering everything. That's more than enough. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, and Catherine let herself sink into it, into him, into this new reality where she was no longer alone, no longer just surviving, but actually living. When they finally moved to the bed, hers, theirs, she'd have to get used to that. It was with a sense of rightness that transcended the physical, though the physical was good too, better than she remembered, made sacred by love and commitment and the simple fact of choosing each other deliberately. Later, curled against his side in the darkness, listening to Micah's soft breathing from across the room and Celis's heartbeat beneath her ear, Catherine thought about the journey that had led her here, the hunger and the fear and the desperation that had driven her to Morrison's store that cold afternoon, the stranger who'd seen her turned away and refused to look past it like everyone else. The impossible kindness that had somehow, miraculously, transformed into this, into love and marriage and family. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Celis's voice was drowsy, half asleep already. For seeing me. For staying. For all of it. His arm tightened around her. Thank you for letting me. For trusting me. For giving me a home. They drifted to sleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Catherine woke in the night briefly, momentarily disoriented, she felt the solid warmth of another person beside her and remembered. She wasn't alone anymore. Would never be alone again. She closed her eyes and sank back into sleep, deeper and more peaceful than she'd managed in years. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with the promise of snow, the kind of storm that would trap them inside for days, maybe longer. Catherine woke to find Celis already up, stoking the fire, moving quietly so as not to wake Micah. She watched him for a moment before he noticed she was awake, cataloging the reality of him. This man who was now her husband, who'd taken on responsibility for her and her son without hesitation or complaint. Morning, he said when he caught her watching, his smile soft and private. Sleep well? Better than I have in years, she admitted. You? Like the dead. Your bed's more comfortable than any boarding house cot. He came back to sit on the edge of the mattress, brushed her hair back from her face with gentle fingers. Storm's coming, big one by the look of the sky. We're going to be stuck inside for a while. We've got food, Catherine said, mentally reviewing their supplies. Plenty of firewood, we'll be fine. Better than fine. Celis leaned down, kissed her forehead. We're together. That's all that matters. The storm hit around noon, wind howling like something alive and angry, snow falling so thick and fast that the world beyond the windows disappeared into white. Inside, they made the cabin as secure as they could, banking the fire high, stuffing rags in the cracks around the door, hanging blankets over the windows for extra insulation. Micah thought it was an adventure, helping move supplies around, stacking firewood near the stove so they wouldn't have to go outside for more. By evening, they were thoroughly snowed in, drifts piling against the door and walls, the wind shrieking overhead. Catherine cooked supper while Celis taught Micah a complicated card game involving strategy and luck, their laughter punctuating the storm's rage. When she set the food on the table, rabbit stew with vegetables and fresh bread made possible by Celis's provisions, Micah said grace without prompting. Thank you, God, for this food, and for Mama, and for Papa Celis who stayed, and for keeping us safe and warm. Amen. Amen, Catherine and Celis echoed, and she had to blink back tears again. When had she become such a crier? Or maybe she'd always been, just hadn't had reason for the tears to be happy ones. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being trapped in close quarters, learning each other's rhythms and habits, figuring out how to exist as a family unit instead of 3 separate people sharing space. There were small frustrations. Celis left his boots in the middle of the floor. Catherine was particular about how dishes should be washed. Micah got restless and whiny when cooped up too long. But there was also laughter and stories and the slow building of shared history. On the second night, when the wind was at its worst and the cabin creaked under the assault, Micah climbed into bed between them, seeking comfort from the storm's violence. Celis wrapped them both in his arms, told stories about riding out storms on the trail, made it all seem like an adventure instead of something to fear. Catherine felt Micah relax against them, felt her own fear ease, and marveled at how much difference it made to have someone else there to shoulder the burden of worry. By the third morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine, the familiar landscape rendered strange and beautiful. Celis had to dig them out, shoveling a path from the door to the barn first, then to the well, then wider to give them room to move. Catherine and Micah helped where they could, though mostly they just got in the way and threw snowballs at each other like children. I should go check my place, Celis said over lunch, brushing snow from his hair. Make sure the roof held, that nothing got damaged. We'll come with you, Catherine said immediately. I want to see it, our future home. So they bundled up, all 3 of them, and made the trek through snow that came up to Micah's thighs in places, forcing Celis to carry him more often than not. The boy didn't complain, just wrapped his arms around Celis's neck and chattered about everything and nothing, perfectly content. The Jacobson place, the Whitlow place now, Catherine reminded herself, came into view after about an hour of difficult walking. The cabin was larger than hers, built of better lumber, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. The barn was solid, its roof heavy with snow but intact. There was a chicken coop that needed repairs, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and acres of land stretching out in every direction, white and endless. "Oh," Catherine breathed, taking it all in. "Silas, it's beautiful." "It will be," he agreed, "once we fix it up proper. I was thinking we could expand the cabin, add a second room for Micah, maybe eventually—" He trailed off, looking at her sidelong. "Eventually what?" "Eventually more children," he finished quietly. "If you wanted, no pressure, just, it's something I've thought about." Catherine's hand went instinctively to her belly, flat and empty. She'd thought her childbearing days were over, had resigned herself to Micah being her only child after Thomas died. But the possibility of more children, Silas's children, made something warm bloom in her chest. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." His smile could have melted all the snow in Wyoming. He set Micah down, pulled Catherine close, kissed her right there in the middle of what would someday be their ranch, their home, their legacy. When they separated, Micah was grinning at them, jumping up and down in the snow. "Can I have a baby brother?" he demanded. "I want someone to play with." "We'll see what we can do," Silas said, laughing. "These things take time, son." They explored the property together, Silas pointing out where he planned to build corrals, where the best grazing was, how the creek ran year-round and provided reliable water. Catherine could see it all coming together in her mind. Horses in the pasture, chickens in the coop, maybe a milk cow, a garden planted in that south-facing slope, a real ranch, a real home, built by their own hands and determination. "When can we move in?" she asked as they prepared to head back to her cabin before dark. "Spring," Silas said. "Need to do too many repairs first, and working in winter weather is slow going. But come March or April, when the ground thaws and the days get longer, we'll make it happen, all three of us together." That winter passed in a blur of work and growing comfort with each other. Silas split his time between both properties, sometimes staying overnight at his place when the work demanded it, but always coming back to Catherine and Micah within a day or two. They fell into patterns, learned each other's rhythms, built the infrastructure of a marriage that would last. There were hard moments, too, times when money got tight despite Silas's savings, when illness struck and Catherine spent 3 terrified days nursing Micah through a fever while Silas rode through a blizzard to fetch Doc Harrison. Times when they argued about small things blown large by stress and exhaustion, when Catherine's fierce independence clashed with Silas's protective instincts. But they learned to talk through the hard moments, to apologize when wrong, to choose each other deliberately, even when it wasn't easy. And there were moments of pure joy. The first time Micah called Silas Pa without the Silas attached, just Pa, simple and sure. The night Catherine told Silas she was pregnant, his face transforming with wonder and disbelief and fierce, protective love. The day in late February when they finally received a letter from Silas's sister in Missouri, giving her blessing to his marriage and promising to visit come summer. Small victories, small happinesses, building into something larger and more permanent. By the time March arrived, bringing with it the first hints of thaw and the promise of easier days ahead, Catherine could barely remember the woman she'd been before Silas Whitlow had walked into her life. That woman had been so tired, so beaten down, so certain that survival was the best she could hope for. This woman, this Catherine who was loved and partnered and growing a child in her belly, knew that survival wasn't the best thing. Living was. Building was. Loving was. She stood on the porch of her cabin one early spring evening, watching the sun set over land that would soon be left behind for better land, a better home. Felt Silas's arms come around her from behind, his hands settling over her still flat stomach with possessive tenderness. "Ready for the next chapter?" he murmured against her hair. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with everything she was. The move happened in stages, spread across 3 weeks in April, when the mud had finally dried enough to make the road between properties passable. Silas had purchased a sturdy wagon from the smithy in town, and each day they'd load it with whatever could be spared from the old cabin: furniture, supplies, tools, the accumulated debris of Catherine's previous life. Micah treated it like the grandest adventure, running between the two homes, claiming which room would be his in the new place, planning where they'd put the chickens he'd been promised once they got settled. Catherine felt the change more acutely than either of the males in her life. This cabin, shabby and patched as it was, had been her home for 5 years. She'd brought Micah here as an infant, had nursed Thomas through his final illness in that bed by the window, had survived the worst years of her life within these walls. Leaving it felt like closing a book she'd been forced to read but had somehow learned to bear. There was grief in the leaving. Even knowing what they were moving toward was infinitely better. On the final day, when the cabin stood empty except for the few pieces of broken furniture they'd decided to leave behind, Catherine walked through each room one last time. Her footsteps echoed on the bare floor, and dust motes danced in the spring sunlight streaming through windows she'd cleaned hundreds of times. She touched the doorframe of what had been her bedroom, remembered the girl she'd been when she first crossed this threshold, young, hopeful, certain that love and determination would be enough to conquer the frontier. "You ready?" Silas's voice was gentle behind her, understanding without needing explanation. Almost. Catherine moved to the small window that overlooked the creek, the view she'd stared at through countless sleepless nights. "I know it's foolish, being sentimental about a place that held so much hardship, but it was mine. The only thing that was truly mine after Thomas died." "Not foolish," Silas said, coming to stand beside her. "This place kept you alive. Kept Micah safe. That deserves respect, even if we're leaving it behind." He paused, then added quietly, "Want to say goodbye proper?" She did. They stood together in the empty cabin for another few minutes, Catherine silently thanking the structure for its shelter, for holding together through storms and seasons, for being enough even when it felt like nothing. Then she took Silas's hand, and they walked out together, closing the door behind them with a finality that felt both sad and right. Micah was already in the wagon, bouncing with impatience. "Can we go now? Can we finally go?" "We can go," Catherine confirmed, letting Silas help her up onto the seat. Her pregnancy was beginning to show now, just a small swell beneath her dress, and he was increasingly protective about her not overexerting herself. She'd argued at first, unused to being cared for, but had learned to accept it as an expression of love rather than a limitation of her capability. The ride to their new home, the Whitlow Ranch, though they hadn't officially named it yet, took less than an hour, but it felt like traveling to a different world. The property looked transformed from when they'd first seen it buried in snow. Spring had painted everything green, and wildflowers dotted the meadows in splashes of yellow and purple. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and birds Catherine couldn't identify filled the air with song. The cabin, too, had been transformed. Silas had spent weeks working on it, and the results showed: new shingles on the roof, fresh chinking between the logs, the porch rebuilt and sturdy. He'd even managed to paint the front door a cheerful blue, using paint he'd bartered for with some carpentry work in town. It looked like a home, not just a structure. It looked like a place where happiness might actually be possible. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitlow," Silas said as he helped her down from the wagon. Mrs. Whitlow. She still wasn't completely used to the name, to the identity it represented, but hearing it spoken with such warmth made her smile. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. Micah had already bolted inside, his excited shouts echoing from within. "Mama! Papa! Come see! There's a real ladder to the loft, and the stove is huge, and—" They followed him in, and Catherine felt something settle in her chest at the sight. The main room was larger than her entire previous cabin had been, with space for a proper kitchen area, a dining table, and a sitting area near the stone fireplace. The loft above would be Micah's domain, accessed by a sturdy ladder Silas had built. Through a doorway was the bedroom, their bedroom, with a real bed frame Silas had constructed, a window that faced east to catch the morning sun, and enough space that Catherine didn't feel like she was living in a box. "There's even a root cellar," Silas was explaining to Micah, stocked with preserves from the Jacobsons. They left them behind. "And out back there's room for that garden your mama's been planning. Good soil, lots of sun." Catherine walked through the space slowly, touching surfaces, opening the few cabinets, imagining how they'd fill this home with life and noise and memory. It was overwhelming in the best way, this abundance of space, of possibility, of future. That first night in the new house, they ate a simple supper of beans and cornbread, seated around their table in their home, and Catherine felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: contentment. Not the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been starving and was now fed, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found their place in the world and knew it. After Micah had climbed to his loft and settled into sleep, his soft breathing drifting down to where Catherine and Silas sat by the fire, she leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this, for making it possible." "We made it possible," Silas corrected. "Together. That's how it works now." His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of couple who'd learned each other's rhythms. "Though I should be thanking you. Never had a home before, not a real one. Just places I stayed between drives. This is everything I didn't know I needed." They sat in comfortable silence, watching flames dance in the hearth, until Catherine worked up the courage to voice the fear that had been growing in her mind. "What if I'm not good at this? At being happy, I mean. I've spent so long just surviving, just getting through each day. What if I don't know how to do anything else?" Silas was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I think happiness is like any other skill. You learn it by practicing. Some days will be better than others. Some days you'll wake up and still feel that weight of old sorrows. But we'll practice together, and we'll get better at it. And when one of us forgets how, the other can remind them." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Besides, you're already doing it. Right now, sitting here with me, safe and warm. That's happiness. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that." Maybe he was right. Maybe happiness wasn't some grand, elusive thing, but rather a collection of small moments, shared meals, quiet evenings, the sound of your child sleeping peacefully above you. Maybe she'd been looking for something elaborate when the simple truth was sitting right here holding her hand. The spring weeks passed in a blur of activity. There was so much to do: establishing routines, planting the garden, repairing the last of the property's infrastructure, acquiring the livestock they'd need to make the ranch functional. Silas purchased 4 horses at auction, good stock that he planned to breed and train for sale. Catherine focused on the garden, coaxing vegetables from the soil with the same determination she'd applied to survival, and was rewarded with tiny green shoots that promised abundance. Micah thrived in the new environment. He grew taller, filled out, lost the hollow-cheeked look that had marked their poorest days. Silas taught him to ride, patiently working with him until the boy could stay in the saddle without assistance, could control his mount with increasing confidence. Catherine watched these lessons from the porch, one hand resting on her growing belly, and felt her heart swell with emotions too complex to name. They made trips to town together now, the 3 of them, and Catherine noticed the shift in how people treated them. She was no longer the pitiful widow to be either ignored or condescended to. She was Mrs. Whitlow, wife of a man with land and prospects, pregnant with new life, visibly cared for. Some of the women who'd been coldest to her before now smiled and made conversation, asking about her garden, admiring her dress, new, purchased with Silas's money, and she was learning not to feel guilty about that. She responded with polite coolness, not quite ready to forgive their earlier cruelty, but willing to be civil for Silas's sake. Amelia Pritchard, however, seemed unable to let go of her judgment. She stopped Catherine outside the general store one afternoon in early May, her pretty face arranged in what she probably thought was a concerned expression. "Mrs. Whitlow," she said, managing to make the name sound like an accusation. "I hear congratulations are in order. A child already. How fortunate." Catherine felt her spine stiffen. "Thank you, Mrs. Pritchard. We're very happy about it." "I'm sure you are." Amelia's eyes dropped to Catherine's middle, calculating. "Though some might wonder at the timing. You've been married, 4 months? And already showing? Makes a person think." The implication was clear and insulting. Catherine felt heat flood her face, not from shame, because she had nothing to be ashamed of, but from pure rage. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't get her labeled as hysterical, a voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Pritchard." Silas materialized beside Catherine, his tone pleasant, but with an edge that made it clear he'd heard everything. "I couldn't help but overhear. You seem to be implying something about my wife's character. I'm sure I misunderstood, since no civilized person would insult a pregnant woman in the middle of town." Amelia's face went white, then red. I wasn't I merely meant, you merely meant to spread gossip and make baseless insinuations, Celis said flatly. Let me be clear. My wife's timeline is nobody's business but ours. However, since you seem so interested, I'm happy to inform you that we're expecting in September, which anyone with basic arithmetic skills can figure out is appropriate timing. Now, unless you'd like to continue this conversation with my attorney present, I suggest you move along. Attorney? Amelia stammered. I don't see why. Slander is a serious matter, Mrs. Pritchard. I'd hate for this to become a legal issue. Celis's expression was mild, but his eyes were steel. I protect what's mine, always. Amelia fled, her face burning, and Catherine felt simultaneously grateful for Celis's defense and uncomfortable that she'd needed defending at all. When Amelia was out of earshot, she turned to her husband. Thank you for that, but I could have handled— I know you could have, Celis interrupted gently. You're more than capable of fighting your own battles, but you don't have to anymore. That's what having a partner means. Sometimes I fight for you, sometimes you fight for me, and sometimes we fight together. Today was a me day. He took her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Besides, I've been wanting to put that woman in her place for months. Felt good. Despite herself, Catherine laughed. You would have actually gotten an attorney? Absolutely. Nobody insults my wife and gets away with it. He was completely serious, and the protective fierceness in his voice made her feel cherished in a way she'd never experienced before Thomas, and certainly not during her marriage to him. They finished their shopping and headed home, but the encounter with Amelia had shaken something loose in Catherine. That night, after Micah had gone to bed and they were alone, she brought it up. Do you ever worry what people think? About us? About how fast everything happened? Celis looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression thoughtful. Honestly, no. I know what's true. You know what's true, and that's all that matters. People are going to talk regardless of what we do or don't do. Might as well give them something real to discuss instead of made-up nonsense. But it bothers you when they insult me. I could see it today. That's different. I don't care if people gossip about us as a couple. That's just entertainment for bored folks. But when someone attacks your character specifically, implies you're something you're not, tries to make you feel small, that I won't tolerate. He set down his work, gave her his full attention. You've been through enough, Catherine. You don't deserve to be anyone's target for cruelty. Not anymore. Not while I'm alive to prevent it. His words settled into her like warmth spreading through cold limbs. I'm not used to being protected, she admitted. Thomas tried, in his way, but he was so focused on his dreams, on proving himself, that I ended up being the one who had to be strong for both of us. And after he died, there was no one but me. I got used to that. Expected it. Well, you'll have to get unused to it, Celis said, a smile tugging at his mouth. Because I'm not going anywhere, and I'm stubborn about taking care of what's mine. You'll just have to suffer through having someone who puts you first. Think you can manage? I can manage, Catherine said, and found herself smiling back. Though I maintain my right to fight my own battles when I choose to. Wouldn't dream of stopping you, Celis assured her. Just know you've got backup now. Always. As spring deepened into early summer, the ranch began to take on the character they'd envisioned. The garden flourished under Catherine's care, producing vegetables in abundance. The horses Celis was training showed promising progress. They acquired chickens from a neighbor, and Micah took to caring for them with surprising dedication, collecting eggs each morning and reporting on each hen's personality as if they were people. Catherine's pregnancy advanced without complication, though the summer heat made her uncomfortable in ways she tried not to complain about. Celis noticed anyway, he always noticed, and did what he could to help. He'd haul extra water so she could cool herself in the heat of the day, would take over the heavier garden work without being asked, would rub her swollen feet in the evenings while Micah read aloud from his primer. In late June, they received a letter from Celis's sister announcing she'd be visiting in July, bringing her 3 daughters. Catherine felt a spike of anxiety at the news. What if his sister didn't approve of her? What if she thought Celis had married beneath himself, tied himself to a poor widow out of some misguided sense of obligation? Her fears must have shown on her face because Celis laughed and pulled her close. Rose is going to love you, he assured her. She's been after me for years to settle down, find someone, stop living like a tumbleweeds rolling from place to place. You're the answer to her prayers. Trust me. Still, Catherine spent the week before Rose's arrival cleaning obsessively, wanting the house to be perfect, wanting to prove she was worthy of Celis, worthy of being welcomed into his family. Celis finally took the broom from her hands and sat her down. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "Rose doesn't care if there's dust in the corners or if the windows are perfectly clean. She cares that I'm happy, that I found a home. And I have. You are my home, Catherine. You and Micah and this baby we're waiting for. That's what Rose will see, and that's what will matter to her." He was right, of course. Rose arrived with her daughters, aged 12, 9, and 7, in a flurry of hugs and laughter and immediate acceptance. She was a handsome woman in her early 40s, with Celis's same dark hair and kind eyes, and she embraced Catherine like a sister the moment they met. "Thank God," Rose said fervently, holding Catherine at arm's length to look at her properly. "Thank God someone finally got through to this stubborn man. I was starting to think he'd die alone on some cattle trail, too proud to admit he wanted something more." She glanced at Celis with affectionate exasperation. "And pregnant already? You don't waste time, do you?" "Rose," Celis protested, but he was grinning. "Let the poor woman breathe before you start interrogating her." "I'm not interrogating, I'm welcoming," Rose corrected, turning back to Catherine. "You have made my brother happier than I've ever seen him. I can tell just by looking at him. That makes you family, and family gets hugged whether they want it or not." The week of Rose's visit passed in a blur of activity and conversation. Her daughters adored Micah, who reveled in finally having other children to play with. They ran wild on the property, inventing elaborate games, helping with chores, filling the house with noise and energy that was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. In the evenings, after the children had collapsed into exhausted sleep, Catherine and Rose would sit on the porch, while Celis did final checks on the animals. Rose told stories about their childhood, about growing up with an abusive father, and how Celis had protected her as much as he could, taking beatings meant for her, making sure she and their younger siblings got fed even when it meant going hungry himself. "He's always been that way," Rose said, her voice soft with old affection. "Always putting others first. It's why I worried so much about him, thought he'd give everything away and leave nothing for himself." She glanced at Catherine. "But then he met you, and suddenly he was writing letters about building a home, starting a ranch, making plans. I knew something had changed. Knew you must be special." "I'm not," Catherine protested. "I'm just a woman who got lucky that he happened to see me on the worst day of my life and decided to help." "You're a woman who was strong enough to accept help," Rose corrected. "That's harder than it sounds. And you're a woman who saw my brother for what he is, good, kind, worth loving, instead of just a convenient solution to your problems. Don't think I can't see the way you look at him. You love him, really love him." "I do," Catherine admitted. "More than I thought I could love anyone again after Thomas. It's terrifying, actually, caring this much, knowing how much it would hurt if I lost him." "That's the price of love," Rose said quietly, "the fear of loss. But the alternative is living without love at all, and that's worse. Believe me, I know. I spent 5 years after my first husband died convinced I'd never feel anything again. Then I met Daniel, and he was patient enough to wait while I learned how to open my heart again. Best decision I ever made." Catherine thought about that conversation later, after Rose and her family had departed amid promises to visit again and invitations for Catherine and Celis to come to Missouri. She thought about the price of love and the fear of loss, and how she'd been so convinced that protecting herself from hurt meant avoiding attachment altogether. What a waste that would have been, to refuse this happiness out of fear, to deny Micah a father, to spend the rest of her life alone rather than risk the pain of potential loss. In late August, when the heat was at its worst and Catherine's pregnancy was in its final weeks, disaster struck in the form of a grass fire. It started on the neighboring property, someone's campfire inadequately extinguished, and spread with terrifying speed through the dry summer growth. Celis saw it first, the line of smoke rising in the distance, and immediately understood the danger. "Get Micah," he told Catherine urgently. "Pack essentials, documents, money, what food you can carry quickly. If the fire reaches here, we may have to evacuate." Catherine felt panic ice her veins, but she moved automatically, years of crisis management kicking in. She gathered Micah, explained the situation calmly, and together they assembled emergency supplies while Celis rode out to assess the fire's direction and join the neighboring men in fighting it. He was gone for hours. Catherine stood on the porch with Micah pressed against her side, watching smoke darken the sky, trying not to imagine the worst. Other women had lost husbands to fire. She'd heard the stories, knew how quickly disaster could strike, but she refused to let herself spiral into that thinking. Celis was smart, experienced, careful. He'd be all right. He had to be all right. When he finally appeared, riding hard through the dusk, he was covered in soot and ash, exhausted but whole. Catherine felt her knees go weak with relief. He dismounted stiffly, clearly in pain, and she saw the burns on his hands, the singed hair, the way he favored his left side. "It's contained," he said hoarsely. "Won't reach us. But the Anderson place is gone. House, barn, everything. They're going to need help." "Later," Catherine said firmly, taking his arm. "First, we're getting you cleaned up and those burns treated. Then we'll talk about helping the Andersons." He didn't argue, which told her how much pain he was in. She spent the next hour cleaning his wounds, applying salve Doc Harrison had sold her for emergencies, bandaging his hands. Micah hovered anxiously, fetching water and supplies, his young face tight with worry. "I'm all right, son," Celis assured him. "Just got a bit too close to the flames. Nothing serious." But Catherine could see the toll it had taken, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly from adrenaline wearing off. When Micah had finally been convinced to go to bed, she helped Celis to their room and made him lie down. "You could have died," she said quietly, the fear she'd been holding at bay for hours finally breaking free. "You could have died, and I would have been left alone again, and I don't think I could survive that, not after finally finding you." "Hey." He reached up with one bandaged hand, cupped her face despite the pain it must have caused. "I'm here. I'm alive. And I'm not planning on going anywhere." "You can't promise that," Catherine said, tears streaming now. "Nobody can promise that. Thomas thought he'd live to be old. Life doesn't work that way." "No," Celis agreed quietly. "It doesn't. But I can promise I'll be as careful as I know how to be. I can promise I'll fight like hell to stay alive, to come back to you and Micah and this baby. I can promise you matter more to me than anything else, and that will always guide my choices." He pulled her down gently to lie beside him. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But we can't let that fear stop us from living, from being happy. Thomas wouldn't want that for you, and I don't want it for either of us." Catherine pressed her face against his shoulder, the one that wasn't burned, and let herself cry, releasing all the terror and relief and overwhelming love that had built up over the past hours. Celis held her as well as he could with his injured hands, murmuring reassurance, being solid and present and alive. The next day, true to his word, Celis organized help for the Andersons despite his injuries. Catherine found herself hosting the displaced family, parents and 4 children, while the community came together to provide supplies and plan rebuilding efforts. It was exhausting work, managing a household that had suddenly doubled in size, but it was also deeply satisfying. This was what community was supposed to be, people helping each other through disasters, sharing what they had, making sure nobody fell through the cracks. Amelia Pritchard even showed up with donated clothes and food, her manner subdued. She approached Catherine hesitantly, as if expecting to be turned away. "I wanted to help," she said quietly, "and I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was cruel and unnecessary, and I'm sorry." Catherine studied her for a long moment, seeing genuine remorse in the other woman's face. "Thank you," she said finally. "I appreciate that. And the Andersons appreciate the donations." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acceptance. Sometimes that was enough. The Andersons stayed with them for 2 weeks while emergency shelter was constructed on their property. In that time, Catherine went into labor, delivering a healthy baby girl with Rose serving as midwife. She'd stayed on after the fire, insisting she wouldn't leave until her new niece or nephew arrived. The birth was difficult, longer and harder than Micah's had been, and there were moments when Catherine was certain she couldn't endure another contraction, another wave of pain. But Celis was there, holding her hand, talking her through it, and when their daughter finally emerged, red-faced and squalling, Catherine looked into his tear-filled eyes and knew that every moment of pain had been worth it for this, for the tiny, perfect person they'd created together. "She's beautiful," Silas whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "She's so beautiful, Catherine." They named her Sarah Rose and after Silas's mother. Micah was enchanted with his baby sister, gentle and careful in ways that made Catherine's heart ache with pride. He'd sit for hours just watching her sleep, occasionally reaching out to touch her impossibly small fingers with wondering reverence. "I'll protect her," he told Catherine solemnly one afternoon, "like Papa protects us. I'll make sure nobody ever hurts her." "I know you will," Catherine said, pulling him close. "You're going to be the best big brother." When the Andersons finally moved into their temporary shelter, and Rose departed for Missouri with promises to return next summer, the house felt simultaneously too quiet and perfectly full. Catherine settled into the rhythms of new motherhood, the exhaustion, the midnight feedings, the overwhelming love that made everything else seem small by comparison. Silas was a revelation as a father to an infant, patient and gentle in ways that surprised no one who actually knew him, but drew comments from townspeople who apparently expected cowboys to be useless with babies. "He's better at swaddling than I am," Catherine admitted to Mrs. Harrison one afternoon in town, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms while Silas loaded supplies into their wagon. "That's because he pays attention," Mrs. Harrison said with a smile. "Some men think baby care is beneath them. Good men understand it's part of being a father. And Silas was a good man. Catherine had known it from the start, but watching him with Sarah and Micah confirmed it daily. The way he'd wake with her for night feeding so Catherine could rest. The way he'd walk the floor with Sarah when she was fussy, singing to her in his rough voice until she calmed. The way he still made time for Micah, making sure the boy never felt overlooked now that a baby had arrived. By October, when the leaves were turning and the air carried the first serious hint of winter, Catherine found herself standing on their porch one evening, watching Silas and Micah work together in the corral, training one of the young horses. Sarah was asleep inside, the supper dishes were done, and everything was quiet except for the low murmur of male voices and the occasional whinny from the horses. She thought about the year that had passed since that awful November day when she'd stood outside Morrison's store with her empty basket and her depleted hope. Thought about how impossible it would have seemed then that she'd be here now, married to a good man, living in a solid home, with 2 children and enough to eat and the certain knowledge that tomorrow wouldn't be a desperate scramble for survival. Silas looked up and caught her watching, smiled that private smile reserved just for her, and Catherine felt her heart expand with gratitude and love and the simple recognition that she was happy. Not surviving, not enduring, actually genuinely happy. She smiled back, rested one hand on her stomach where, though it was far too early to be certain, she suspected another child might already be growing. They hadn't planned for this, but Catherine found she didn't mind. They'd built something strong enough to hold as many children as came their way, something that could weather whatever storms life decided to throw at them. The sun set in shades of gold and crimson, painting the sky with promises of good weather to come. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the horses in the pasture answered with soft whickers. The wind carried the smell of hay and horses and home. Catherine wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and went inside to check on Sarah, confident that when Silas and Micah finished their work, they'd come in too, and they'd sit down to evening coffee together, and everything would be exactly as it should be. For now, that was more than enough. It was everything. Winter came early that year, arriving in mid-November with a vengeance that reminded Catherine of her first winters in Wyoming, the kind of cold that found every crack in a building, every weakness in your preparations. But this time she faced it from a position of strength rather than desperation. Their root cellar was stocked with preserves and vegetables from the summer harvest. The barn held hay enough for the horses and the 2 milk cows they'd acquired in September. Firewood was stacked high against the north wall of the cabin, cut and split during the long autumn days when Silas and Micah had worked side by side, the boys' axe strokes growing more confident with each passing week. Sarah was 3 months old now, a fat and happy baby who'd inherited her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes. She was sleeping better at night, which meant Catherine was sleeping better too, emerging from the fog of new motherhood into something clearer and more sustainable. The suspicion she'd had in October had proven correct. She was pregnant again, due sometime in late spring. When she'd told Silas, he'd looked simultaneously thrilled and concerned. 3 children in 2 years, he'd said, shaking his head with wonder. We're building our own small army here. Having regrets? Catherine had asked, only half joking. Not a single one, he'd replied firmly, pulling her close despite her growing middle. Every single one of you is a gift I didn't know I was allowed to ask for. I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming territory, possibly in all of America. The statement had been so earnest, so completely sincere, that Catherine had found herself tearing up yet again. Pregnancy made her emotional in ways she hadn't experienced with Micah, every small kindness or beautiful moment moving her to tears. Silas had learned to simply hand her his handkerchief and wait patiently while she composed herself. The ranch was thriving in ways that exceeded even Silas's optimistic projections. The horses he'd trained had sold well, developing a reputation for being well-mannered and reliable. Ranchers and farmers from surrounding areas sought him out specifically, willing to pay premium prices for animals that had been through his program. He'd taken on 2 apprentices, young men from town who wanted to learn the trade, and the additional help allowed him to expand operations without sacrificing time with his family. Micah, now 7.5, had grown into a serious, capable boy who took his responsibilities with an earnestness that was sometimes heartbreaking. He helped with everything, feeding animals, collecting eggs, watching Sarah when Catherine needed both hands for cooking or cleaning. He was reading at a level well beyond his years, devouring every book they could acquire from the lending library in Cheyenne. Silas had promised him his own horse come spring, a reward for his hard work and dedication, and the boy counted down the days with barely contained excitement. On a particularly cold evening in late December, just days before Christmas, they gathered around the fireplace after supper. Catherine was mending while Silas worked on a harness that needed repairs. Micah sat at the table practicing his letters, and Sarah dozed in a cradle that rocked gently with each movement of Catherine's foot. It was the kind of domestic scene that would have felt impossibly distant during those desperate years after Thomas died, yet now felt as natural as breathing. "Mama?" Micah said suddenly, looking up from his slate. "Tell me again about when you met Papa. The real story, not the short version." Catherine glanced at Silas, saw him smile slightly, remembering. "You've heard it a dozen times." "I know, but I like it. It's like a story from one of my books, except it's real." "All right," Catherine said, setting down her mending. "It was November, almost exactly a year ago now. We were living in the old cabin by Goose Creek, and things were difficult. We didn't have much food, and I'd gone into town to try to get credit at Morrison's store." "And he said no," Micah supplied, knowing this part well. "Because you already owed money." "That's right. I came out of the store feeling about as low as a person can feel, wondering how I was going to feed you, wondering what would happen if I couldn't. And then I heard a voice, your papa's voice, asking if I'd been turned away for food. And you were scared at first," Micah continued, caught up in the narrative, "because you didn't know him and Mama had taught you not to trust strangers." "I was scared," Catherine confirmed, "but I was also desperate. And there was something about him, something in his eyes that was kind without being pitying. He said, 'Come with me, I'll fill your table tonight.' And I chose to trust him." "Best decision you ever made," Silas interjected, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Best decision I ever made too, offering to help, changed my whole life." "Changed all our lives," Catherine said softly. "Within a week, he decided to stay. Within a month, we were married. People thought we were crazy." "Some still do," Silas added wryly. "But we knew. Sometimes you just know when something's right, even if it doesn't make logical sense. Your papa taught me that." Micah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, "I'm glad you trusted him, Mama. I'm glad he stayed." "Me too, baby," Catherine said, her throat tight. "Me too." The conversation drifted to other topics. What they wanted for Christmas, whether the spring foals would be good breeding stock, the plans for expanding the barn. But Catherine kept thinking about that day, about the moment when she'd made the choice to trust a stranger, and how that single decision had cascaded into everything good in her life now. It was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. The realization that your entire future could pivot on one instant, one choice, one person appearing at exactly the right time. Christmas morning dawned clear and brutally cold, the kind of weather that made you grateful for solid walls and a good fire. Celis was up before dawn, as always, tending to the animals who couldn't care for themselves regardless of holidays. When he came back in, stamping snow from his boots and bringing a gust of frigid air with him, Micah was already awake and vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Can we do presents now? Can we? Is it time?" "Let me get warm first," Celis laughed, moving to the fire to thaw his hands. "And let your mama get breakfast started. Presents can wait another hour." But Catherine was already up, Sarah nursing contentedly, and she nodded toward the corner where they'd placed their modest collection of gifts. "Go ahead, I can cook one-handed." They'd never discussed what they'd get each other. Money was still tight despite the ranch's success, and there was always something that needed buying or fixing. But Catherine had saved carefully from the egg money, the small amount she earned from selling surplus vegetables in town, and she'd bought Celis a new wool scarf to replace the threadbare one he wore daily. For Micah, there was a book, a real book, not borrowed from the library, about adventures in the American West. For Sarah, too young to understand presents, she'd sewn a new dress from calico she'd gotten on sale. Celis's gifts were more practical but no less thoughtful. For Catherine, there was a bolt of good fabric, enough to make herself a dress, and maybe a shirt for Micah too. For Micah, there was a real cowboy hat, sized for a child, and a pair of work gloves that fit his small hands. And for Sarah, impossibly, he'd carved a wooden rattle, the wood polished smooth and painted with flowers. But the real surprise came when Celis pulled out one more package, this one wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He handed it to Catherine with an expression she couldn't quite read, nervous, excited, uncertain. "Open it," he said simply. Inside was a book, a journal, actually, with a leather cover and blank pages. On the first page, in Celis's careful handwriting, was an inscription. "For Catherine, so our story won't be forgotten. Write it all down, the hard parts and the good parts and everything in between. This is a story worth remembering." Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes immediately. "Celis, this is... I don't even know what to say." "Say you'll use it," he said quietly. "Say you'll write about us, about this life we're building. I want our grandchildren to know how we started, how we found each other. I want them to know that good things can come from the hardest circumstances, that love can show up when you least expect it." "I'll use it," Catherine promised, clutching the journal to her chest. "I'll write it all down, every moment." Micah, who'd been examining his new hat in the small mirror they kept by the door, came over to see what his mother was crying about now. When he saw the journal, he nodded seriously. "That's good, Mama. You should write about how Papa saved us, how he was a hero." "I'm not a hero," Celis protested. "I just did what any decent person would do." "That's what makes you a hero," Catherine said softly. "Heroes don't know they're being heroic. They just do what needs doing because it's right." The rest of Christmas Day passed in comfortable domesticity. A special dinner of roasted chicken and potatoes, peppermint sticks for Micah, time spent reading aloud from his new book. When evening fell and the children were asleep, Catherine sat at the table with her new journal, a pencil in hand, and began to write. November 1883. I stood outside Morrison's general store with an empty basket and an emptier hope. My son was hungry. I was hungry. We were 2 bad weeks away from real disaster. Then a stranger spoke to me and everything changed. She wrote for an hour, capturing as much as she could remember about those first days with Celis, the fear and the trust, the meals shared, the work done side by side. When she finally set down the pencil, her hand cramping, Celis looked up from the harness he was working on. "How's it going?" "It's harder than I expected," Catherine admitted, trying to capture everything, all the feelings and details. "But good. Really good. Thank you for this." "Thank you," Celis said, "for giving me a story worth recording." The winter passed in a pattern of work and family time, harsh weather alternating with peaceful interludes. Catherine's pregnancy progressed without complication, though she was more tired this time, more aware of the toll it took on her body. Celis was endlessly patient, taking on extra work without complaint, making sure she rested when she needed to. In late January, they received word that Rose would be visiting again in spring, this time with her entire family, including her husband Daniel. The news delighted everyone. Micah was already planning what he'd show his cousins, and Catherine looked forward to adult female company that didn't judge or gossip. But the visit was still months away, and there was plenty to occupy them in the meantime. Micah turned 8 in February, and they celebrated with a cake Catherine made from precious sugar and eggs, inviting the Anderson children over since their family had become close friends since the fire. The cabin was loud and chaotic with 6 children running around, but it was a good chaos, the kind that spoke of life and community and belonging. March brought the first real thaw, mud season arriving with its attendant mess and difficulty. But it also brought the promise of spring, of new growth, of the foals that would be born in April and May. Silas was busy from dawn to well past dark, managing the breeding program, training the yearlings, teaching his apprentices. Catherine worried about him overworking, but he seemed energized rather than exhausted by the demands on his time. "I love this," he told her one evening, collapsing into bed beside her. "Building something real, something that'll last. Knowing that when Micah's grown, when all our kids are grown, this ranch will still be here. That's a kind of immortality, isn't it? Not the person lasting, but what they built." "Just make sure you last long enough to see those grandchildren you keep talking about," Catherine said, snuggling against his side. "I'm not raising 5 children alone." "5?" Silas's hand moved to her belly, still relatively flat at 4 months. "Are you telling me something I should know?" "No," Catherine laughed. "Just planning ahead. You said you wanted a big family." "I did say that," he agreed, "and I meant it. Though maybe after this one we can slow down a bit. Give your poor body a rest." "We'll see," Catherine said noncommittally. Truth was, she liked being pregnant, liked the feeling of growing life, liked watching Silas's wonder at each stage, liked knowing they were creating something permanent and good. But 3 children in 3 years was exhausting, and she wouldn't mind a break after this baby arrived. In early April, Micah got his promised horse, a gentle mare with a patient temperament, perfect for a young rider still learning. The boy was ecstatic, spending every spare moment with his new companion, grooming her until her coat shone, talking to her constantly. Silas oversaw the riding lessons with careful attention, making sure Micah learned not just how to stay in the saddle, but how to truly communicate with his mount, how to earn her trust and respect. "You're good at this," Catherine observed one afternoon, watching them work together in the corral. "Teaching, I mean. Have you ever thought about taking on more students, young people who want to learn horsemanship?" Silas considered it, his eyes following Micah's progress around the ring. "Maybe. Once things settle down a bit. Could be good income, and I like the idea of passing on skills. Too many young people these days don't know the basics of working with animals." "You could build a real business around it," Catherine said, her mind already working through possibilities. "Training and sales together. People would come from all over the territory." "Getting ambitious, are we?" But Silas was smiling, clearly pleased by her confidence in him. "I'm married to an ambitious man," Catherine replied. "Might as well match his energy." Rose and her family arrived in late April, just as the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to leaf out. This time, Catherine didn't feel the same anxiety she'd experienced the previous summer. Rose had already proven herself an ally and friend, and meeting Daniel, a quiet, solid man who clearly adored his wife, only reinforced Catherine's sense that she'd been welcomed into a good family. The girls, now a year older and therefore even more energetic, immediately swept Micah into their games. They explored the property endlessly, built forts in the barn, helped with chores, and generally filled the house with noise and activity that was sometimes overwhelming, but mostly wonderful. Sarah, now 6 months old and beginning to sit up on her own, was passed between adults and older children, universally adored. One evening, while the children were occupied with some complicated game involving the chickens and a great deal of running, Catherine and Rose sat on the porch watching the sunset. Rose was doing mending, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, while Catherine simply rested, 8 months pregnant now and feeling every day of it. "You look happy," Rose observed, glancing over at her sister-in-law. "Tired, but happy." "I am," Catherine confirmed. "Sometimes I have to remind myself this is real, that it's not all going to disappear if I let my guard down." "That feeling ever go away completely?" Rose asked. "I've been married to Daniel for 6 years now, And I still sometimes wake up half expecting to be back in that awful time after my first husband died, struggling to keep my girls fed. I don't think it does go away, Catherine said slowly. I think people who've known real hardship always carry that awareness, that knowledge of how quickly things can fall apart. But maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe it makes us more grateful for what we have. Maybe, Rose agreed, though I could do with a little less gratitude and a little more taking things for granted sometimes. Must be nice to just assume everything will be fine instead of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to pink. Finally, Rose spoke again, her voice softer. Can I tell you something? Something I haven't even told Celis? Of course. When he wrote to me about you, about deciding to stay in Wyoming and get married, I was worried. It seemed so fast, so impulsive. I thought maybe he was making a mistake, letting his helpful nature override his good judgment. I thought you might be taking advantage of him. Catherine felt a small pang but said nothing, letting Rose continue. But then I got here last summer and saw you two together, and I knew immediately I'd been wrong. The way you look at each other, the way you move around each other like you've been married 20 years instead of a few months, that can't be faked. And watching him with Micah, how natural it is, how much that boy loves him. I knew Celis had found what he'd been looking for his whole life, even if he hadn't known he was searching for it. I was the one taking advantage, Catherine said quietly. He saved my life, Rose, mine and Micah's. We would have starved that winter without him. I married him partially out of gratitude, and I was terrified he'd figure that out and resent me for it. And now? Rose prompted gently. Now I know it was never just gratitude. I loved him before I'd admitted it to myself, maybe from that first morning when he showed up at dawn like he'd promised. He's the best man I've ever known, and I wake up every day amazed that he chose me, that he stayed. Catherine's hand moved to her belly, feeling the baby kick. These children we're making together. They're proof that good things can come from terrible circumstances. That's worth remembering. It is, Rose agreed, and it's worth writing down in that journal I heard Celis gave you for Christmas. These stories need to be told, especially the ones about surviving and rebuilding. Too often we only hear about the dramatic adventures, not about the quiet courage it takes to keep going when everything's falling apart. Catherine thought about that conversation for days afterward, about quiet courage and stories worth telling. She'd been writing regularly in her journal, capturing memories and moments. But Rose's words made her think about purpose, about writing not just for their grandchildren, but for anyone who might need to hear that survival was possible, that joy could follow despair, that help sometimes appeared in unexpected forms. In mid-May, Catherine went into labor with their third child. This birth was faster than Sarah's had been, though no less intense. Doc Harrison attended, along with Rose, who'd delayed her family's departure, specifically to be present for the delivery. Celis waited outside with Daniel, pacing nervously, while Micah kept Sarah occupied in the barn. When the baby finally arrived, a boy this time, healthy and howling, Catherine felt a wave of exhausted relief. Rose cleaned him up and placed him in Catherine's arms, and she marveled once again at the miracle of new life. This tiny person who was half her and half Celis. He's perfect, she whispered, counting fingers and toes, examining the shock of dark hair that crowned his head. He's beautiful, Rose agreed. What are you naming him? Catherine had discussed this with Celis during her pregnancy, and they'd agreed that if the baby was a boy, they'd name him Thomas Benjamin. Thomas after Catherine's first husband, Benjamin after Celis's father, despite his failings. Both men had shaped who they were, for better or worse, and deserving of being remembered. When Celis was finally allowed in, he approached the bed with an expression of such overwhelming emotion that Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes yet again. He sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, looked down at his son, and his face crumpled. Catherine, he managed, his voice breaking. I don't have words. Then don't use words, she said softly. Just be here with us. He was. They sat together, the three of them, while Rose slipped out to give them privacy. Catherine could hear the sounds of celebration from outside, Micah's excited voice telling Sarah that they had a baby brother, Rose and Daniel talking in low tones, the everyday sounds of the ranch continuing despite this moment of transformation. Thank you, Silas finally said, his hand gentle on the baby's head. Thank you for him, for Sarah, for Micah, for all of it. Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger outside a general store. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for seeing me, Catherine replied, for seeing that I needed help and not walking past like everyone else did. Thank you for staying. They sat like that until Rose knocked softly and asked if the other children could come meet their brother. Micah entered first, his eyes huge, approaching the bed like it held something precious and fragile, which it did. When he saw the baby, his face split into a grin. He's so small. Was I that small? Smaller, actually, Catherine said. You were tiny. Thomas is a good size. Thomas, Micah repeated, trying out the name. That was my first papa's name, wasn't it? It was, Catherine confirmed. We wanted to honor him, since he helped give us you, and without you, none of this would have happened. Micah seemed to consider this, his young face serious. Then he reached out one finger, let the baby grasp it with surprising strength. Hi, Thomas. I'm your big brother Micah. I'm going to teach you everything I know, just like Papa Silas taught me. Sarah, held by Rose, babbled something that might have been her version of approval. The baby, Thomas, yawned widely, unconcerned by all the attention. Rose and her family left a week later, after Catherine had recovered enough to be up and around, after they'd celebrated both the new baby and the ranch's growing success. Their departure left the house feeling emptier, but it was a good kind of empty. The satisfaction that came from a visit well enjoyed rather than the loneliness of isolation. Summer arrived in force, hot and demanding, but the ranch was running smoothly enough now that Silas could afford to hire additional help for the busiest times. This meant more time with the family, more evenings spent on the porch after the day's work was done, watching Micah practice his riding while Sarah toddled around under careful supervision and Thomas nursed or slept. On one such evening in late June, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Catherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. She'd filled dozens of pages in her journal now, capturing the story of their family as it unfolded. But tonight, she simply sat beside her husband, their children playing nearby, and let herself be present in the moment without trying to record it for posterity. What are you thinking about? Silas asked, his hand finding hers automatically. How far we've come, Catherine said. A year ago, we were newlyweds figuring everything out. Now we're... She gestured at the scene before them. This. A family. A real, solid family. Best year of my life, Silas said simply. Every single day of it, even the hard ones. There's going to be more hard days, Catherine warned. Babies grow up, things break, money gets tight. Life doesn't stay perfect just because you want it to. I know, Silas said, but we'll face those hard days together. That's what makes them bearable. That's what makes everything worth it, knowing you don't have to carry the weight alone. From the corral, Micah called out, Papa, watch this, and demonstrated a turn he'd been working on, executing it with growing confidence. Silas called back encouragement and praise, and Micah beamed with pride. He's going to be a fine horseman, Catherine observed. Takes after his father. Takes after both of us, Silas corrected. He's got your determination and focus. I just provide the technical knowledge. They watched in companionable silence until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Finally, as twilight descended, they gathered everyone inside for supper, a simple meal of stew and bread, but eaten together, punctuated by conversation and laughter, and the small conflicts that arose when tired children were told they had to finish eating before they could play. After the meal was cleaned up and the children were settled for the night, Micah in his loft, Sarah in her crib, Thomas in the cradle beside Catherine in Silas's bed, they sat together by the fire one last time. Silas was reading aloud from a newspaper that had arrived from Cheyenne, sharing news of territorial politics and economic developments. Catherine was mending yet another pair of Micah's pants, the boy growing so fast that he seemed to outgrow clothes within weeks of getting them. Listen to this, Silas said, looking up from the paper. They're talking about Wyoming becoming a state within the next few years. Full statehood, not just territorial status. That would be something, Catherine said, to be part of that, to see this place mature from frontier territory into a real state. We're part of it already, Silas pointed out. Every ranch that succeeds, every family that puts down roots and builds something lasting, that's what makes statehood possible. We're helping create something permanent. Catherine thought about that, about permanence and legacy, and the idea that their small family's success was connected to something larger. It was both humbling and empowering, the knowledge that their work mattered beyond just their own survival. "Read me more," she said, setting aside her mending. "I want to know what's happening in the world." So Silas read, his voice low and steady, sharing news of places they'd never been and people they'd never meet. But through it all, Catherine was aware of the weight of contentment settling over her like a warm blanket. This was her life now, not perfect, not without struggles, but fundamentally good, fundamentally worth living. When they finally went to bed, Catherine lay in the darkness listening to the familiar sounds of her household. Silas's steady breathing beside her, Thomas's small snuffles from the cradle, the occasional creak of the house settling, wind moving through the cottonwoods outside. She thought about that day outside Morrison's store, about the choice to trust a stranger, about every subsequent choice that had led to this moment. "Still awake?" Silas murmured, his hand finding hers under the blanket. "Just thinking," Catherine whispered back. "About what?" "About how scared I was that day you first spoke to me. How close I came to saying no, to walking away, to choosing pride over help." "But you didn't," Silas said softly. "You chose to trust. That took more courage than most people ever have to show." "It was the best choice I ever made," Catherine said. "Letting you help, letting you stay, letting you love us." "The best choice I ever made," Silas countered, "was stopping when I saw you turned away from that store, was listening to whatever instinct told me that woman needed help and I was in a position to give it. Every good thing in my life now came from that one decision." They lay together in the quiet darkness, hands clasped, connected by more than just touch, by shared history, by the children they'd created, by the future they were building one day at a time. Outside, an owl called, and somewhere in the distance, one of the horses whinnied softly. The sounds of home, of safety, of belonging. Catherine thought about the journal Silas had given her, about all the pages she'd filled with their story. Tomorrow she would write more, would capture this moment, this feeling, but for now she simply existed in it, letting herself feel the full weight of happiness without fear, without reservation, without the constant anxiety that it would all be taken away. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Silas replied. "Always." Thomas whimpered briefly in his cradle, and Catherine started to rise, but Silas stopped her. "I'll get him," he said, already moving. She listened to him soothe their son, humming softly, the same tune he'd played on his harmonica that first afternoon in her old cabin. The sound of it made her throat tight with emotion. This good man who'd walked into her life and refused to walk back out, who'd taken on responsibility for another man's child without hesitation, who loved her not despite her struggles, but because of everything those struggles had taught her about strength and survival. When Silas returned to bed, Thomas settled and sleeping again, Catherine moved closer, rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't stopped that day? If you just kept walking past me?" "Sometimes," Silas admitted. "I'd probably still be droving, still moving from place to place, still sleeping on the ground more nights than not. Still alive, maybe, but not really living, not like this." "I think about it too," Catherine said, "about what would have happened to us if you hadn't helped. I don't know if we would have made it through that winter. I really don't." "But we did make it," Silas said firmly. "We made it, and we're here, and we're building something that'll outlast both of us. That's what matters. Not what might have been, but what is." Catherine nodded against his shoulder, accepting the truth of it. What might have been was irrelevant. What mattered was what they had now, what they were creating together, the life they were living with intention and love and stubborn determination to make it work. She drifted toward sleep gradually, comfortable and safe, and surrounded by everyone she loved most in the world. Just before consciousness slipped away entirely, she had one final thought. This was what happiness felt like. Not constant joy or the absence of struggle, but rather the deep satisfaction that came from building something real with someone who chose you deliberately, who saw you at your worst and decided to stay anyway. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. Another pregnancy that ended in miscarriage, leaving Catherine grief-stricken and Silas helplessly worried. A harsh winter that killed 3 of their horses despite their best efforts. Micah breaking his arm in a fall that scared everyone half to death. The normal struggles of raising children and running a ranch and maintaining a marriage through all of life's complications. But they faced it all together, exactly as Silas had promised they would. When Catherine struggled with the miscarriage, he held her through the worst of the grief and made sure she knew her worth wasn't tied to her ability to bear children. When the horses died, she reminded him that they'd survived worse losses and would survive this too. When Micah was injured, they took turns sitting up with him through the pain, distracting him with stories and games and the constant reassurance that he would heal. And there were victories too, more children born healthy and strong, 2 more daughters who rounded out their family. The ranch growing more successful each year, Silas's reputation attracting buyers from across the territory and beyond. Micah growing into a capable young man who could handle the ranch work alongside his father. Sarah showing an unexpected talent for numbers and beginning to manage the ranch accounts before she was even 12. Thomas developing a gift for working with difficult horses, able to gentle animals others had written off as impossible. Through it all, Catherine wrote. She filled journal after journal with the story of their family, capturing not just the dramatic moments, but the small, daily ones. The morning rituals, the evening conversations, the 1,000 tiny interactions that comprised a life lived in partnership. She wrote about the struggles and the victories, about the fear and the joy, about the journey from desperation to abundance. On their 10th anniversary, Silas gave her a cedar chest to store all her filled journals, beautiful work he'd commissioned from a craftsman in Cheyenne. Inside, he'd carved their names and the date they'd met, along with a simple inscription. From empty baskets to full tables, from strangers to family, this is what love built. Catherine ran her fingers over the carved words, tears streaming down her face, and thought about that cold November day when a stranger had offered help, and she'd been brave enough to accept it. Thought about every choice they'd made since then, to trust, to commit, to build something permanent in a world that seemed designed to tear things apart. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. For all of it. For seeing me, for staying, for loving me even when I didn't think I deserved to be loved. Thank you, Silas replied, pulling her close. For letting me, for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but good intentions and a desire to help. For building this life with me. For being brave enough to trust when trust had been beaten out of you. You gave me everything, Catherine, everything that matters. They stood together in their home, surrounded by the evidence of a decade's worth of work and love. The children playing outside, the sound of horses in the corral, the smell of bread baking, the 1,000 small comforts they'd accumulated. It wasn't a perfect life. There had been sorrows alongside the joys, failures alongside the successes. But it was a good life, a full life, a life built on the foundation of that first improbable act of kindness outside Morrison's general store. And in the end, Catherine thought, that was what mattered most. Not that their life was perfect, but that they'd built it together. Not that they never struggled, but that they faced those struggles as partners. Not that everything always worked out, but that they kept trying anyway, kept choosing each other, kept building even when building was hard. She took Silas's hand, this man who'd walked into her life when she'd needed him most and refused to walk back out, and led him outside to where their children were waiting to celebrate their parents' anniversary. The sun was setting over their land, their home, their legacy, painting everything in shades of gold. It was beautiful. It was real. It was worth every moment of fear and struggle that had come before. It was enough. It was everything. And as Catherine looked around at the life they'd built together, the children, the ranch, the community they'd become part of, the future they were creating, she felt something settle deep in her chest. Not the desperate gratitude of someone who'd escaped disaster, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found their place in the world and knew it was exactly where they belonged. This was home. This was family. This was love. And it had all started with a stranger who'd seen her turned away from a store and said 5 simple words. Come with me. I'll help. Sometimes, Catherine thought, That's all it took to change a life. 5 words spoken with kindness, a choice to trust, and the courage to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. She smiled, squeezed Silas's hand, and walked forward into the evening, into the celebration, into the continuing story of their life together. Behind her, the past held sorrows and struggles. Before her, the future held uncertainty and challenge. But right here, right now, in this perfect moment, she had everything she needed. And that, she thought, was the truest happiness of all.